Hello, everyone. Good morning, and it's so wonderful to be here with all of you today. My name is Haley Tobiason. I am a 2023 graduate from Cal Poly's Environmental Management and Protection program, and this is the first conference I've ever presented at, so bear with me. I'd like to thank Ron Larson and Theo for allowing me this opportunity to present, and it's really wonderful to be surrounded by so many environmental professionals and lake enthusiasts alike. I've already been learning so much, and it's been nice to be back in kind of like an academic environment and kind of be challenged by a lot of unfamiliar but beautifully analyzed data and graphs. While my presentation today will be a little less scientifically structured, I hope that you all will learn something, and if not, enjoy the break for your thinking caps before more Latin and linear regression. So I know many of you may be familiar with Lake Abert and have maybe had the chance to even go out there, but just in case you aren't familiar, I'm really excited to be able to introduce you. So a little bit about what and where Lake Abert is, and it's one of 3 hypersaline lakes in the Great Basin and Oregon's only saline lake. It's located in the southeastern corner. I don't have a pointer, but you can see on the map, kind of down in the corner, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And then it's near Paisley, Lakeview, which are very small towns out there. And yeah, at full capacity, it is 105 square miles. So a big lake, but the average depth is only 5 feet, so shallow. It's a terminal lake, and its primary source of fresh water is the Schuylkill River. And along the western shore is Abert Rim, which you can see in the background of this picture. It's a 2,500 foot tall ridge that borders the lake for about 30 miles. And along snaking below Abert Rim is Highway 395, which provides excellent views of the lake and has pullouts for pretty much birders and people taking a rest along the lake to get out and take pictures. So perfect for birding and for surveying, like I did this summer. So I must admit, I had never heard about Lake Abert before I came across the Oregon Natural Desert Association's posting for their 2023 Hillis intern position this summer, surveying birds at the lake back in May. And with 1 month left of my degree, I was really looking forward to an internal compass pointing north back to Bend, where I grew up. I was really looking for an opportunity to do something new, challenging, unique, and something to dive headfirst into within the realm of conservation. I wasn't really sure what I was getting myself into in applying, but I mean, I'd never heard of Lake Abert. We have a salt lake in Oregon. That's what I was thinking. I'd never used eBird, and had certainly not done a survey to this extent before on this scale, but I saw it as an opportunity to learn all of these things. And fast forward 4 months, 15 surveys, over 360,000 birds counted, and countless bugs on my windshield. I can say I know Lake Abert and have seen firsthand the rich diversity of wildlife it supports from my season on its salty shores. And the stars of the shore are the birds. So Lake Abert is a key stopover location for migratory shorebirds and waterfowl along the Pacific Flyway. A lot of these birds that frequent the lake, they have long distances to go. And for example, the phalaropes, which are the most numerous birds at the lake, they go all the way down to South America in Argentina. So they have thousands of miles long journey, and they need all the energy that they can get for that. And Lake Abert is the perfect place for them when it has water. It has plenty of food and space for everyone, and some birds even breed and nest. And they all refuel and rest along their travels through the season of June to October, which there's a little bit on each side, but that's the main migration period, which I did my surveys through the early June to early October. So a little bit more about the types of birds that are at Lake Abert. We have the American avocet, which is in the bottom left corner. That's like the most, I guess, distinctive bird there, with its orange cap, and it has a really unique call that kind of is really distinguishable. And then Wilson's phalarope, red-necked phalarope, the black-necked stilt, which is in the top right corner. That's my favorite. Eared grebes, the northern shovelers, which are in the top left, kind of on the water. You can see them. Willets, long-billed dowitchers, gull species. It's kind of hard to tell which is which. You just call them gulls. And then peeps. So we got the western sandpiper, least sandpiper down in the right corner, and snowy plovers, which I didn't see any of those, but Ron told me they're on the other side of the lake usually, which you can't really get to, but I'm sure they're there. So just a brief overview of the data that I collected this summer. This is an aggregation. So I collected data by species, but these are the total counts for each survey. And as you can see, the peak was, I believe it was August, my survey on August 10th. I counted 46,203 individuals. So that was wonderful. There's so many birds out there after some drought years. To see that abundance was really encouraging. And as you can also see, it took some time to pick up. So I really got to get my footing and adjusted to the surveying and what the birds looked like. And I think the birds were on my side for the surveying. And so the reason why there are so many birds at the lake is for its all-you-can-eat buffet menu of unique cuisine. On this menu are brine shrimp, which you can see on the left, and alkali flies, which feed on benthic algae at the lake and survive between 3 and 8% salinity. The birds rely on this abundant prey to replenish their energy stores on their migration, as I mentioned. Although these two invertebrates survive at a wide salinity range, 3 to 8%, that's pretty big range. Abundance does drop at the high and low salinity levels on the outside of this optimal range. And this is particularly problematic when it comes to the higher salinity ranges, because the productivity significantly decreases when there's lower dissolved oxygen in the water, and due to increased demands of fresh water upstream on the Schuylkill River and coupled with environmental conditions of drought and increased heat, so evaporation. The salinity levels at the lake have been trending upward. So the life cycle of these invertebrates can also be disrupted and the productivity decreases. That's kind of the extent of what I know of the life cycle of these. If you are more interested, I would say pick up a copy of this book and become an expert on Lake Abert by our one and only Ron Larson, which I'm so excited to dive into this book, you guys. It's great. So briefly, I'll talk about my survey methodology. I went out to the lake about one time a week and would start in the morning and survey pretty much until I was done. It usually took between 3 and 4 hours. And as you can see, there's a map there that I made of all the kind of possible pullouts along Highway 395 where you can stop and count birds. Some of them are really close together, so there's overlap, and I wouldn't stop at every single spot, just kind of how I could to get the best coverage of the lake without any double counting and overlap there. And I used eBird to record all of my observations. At each stop, I would start a new checklist. If you're not familiar, eBird is developed by Cornell, and it's a really accessible and intuitive approach to just bird watching, but it's also very scientific in the way that it can be used for data collection and something like this. And yeah, so I would start a checklist on every stop, record all the species and the numbers, and then eBird also records the GPS location, the time spent surveying, the type of survey, and all this other important information to have a full data set. At the end, I would create a trip report that would put all the data together, and yeah, I would suggest, if you haven't, check out eBird if you're into birding and or maybe want to get into it. It's a very great place to start. And then I would use a spotting scope and binoculars to do the counts. I usually would start on the north end of the lake because that's where the most birds would be found. So that stop would take maybe an hour sometimes, because that's where all the phalaropes would be, like tens of thousands of them. So it was best to start there when it was cooler and not as bright. And yeah. And then this is a graph of the median bird counts for the past 12 years. The data is from Ron, and then this year's data, 2023, is what I collected. And as you can see, Lake Abert is a resilient ecosystem, and the years in orange, those are drought years. So when it's a drought, the numbers of birds at Lake Abert are significantly impacted, especially birds like the eared grebe, which disable their flight muscles when they arrive to where they're stopping to rest, to put their digestive systems into overdrive. So it's kind of, if they go somewhere and there's not enough food, it's kind of game over. They can't just pick up and find another spot to go. So eared grebes don't even really show up when there's not enough water. They maybe fly by and see, this isn't it, let's go somewhere else. And then, yeah, with all other species, you just tend to see a decrease in their abundance during the drought years. But as we can see, there's resilience there, which is really encouraging because a lot of these bird species, they, Lake Abert is one of their main spots. And if they aren't there, then where are they? Is the question. So along with that, some future implications and importance of continued monitoring at Lake Abert and just spreading awareness about this issue. Lake Abert is a unique, incredible ecosystem that supports hundreds of species of wildlife, and especially these bird species. And it's a small town out there. There's not a lot of people around, and they care about Lake Abert, but they also have their own needs too. And so going forward, developing water management plans that are collaborative and integrative of the knowledge that we have on the life cycles and the data that we've collected, and these patterns that we're seeing, and adaptive to environmental conditions and how these are changing. Some years there's going to be a drought, and so we need to allocate more water to Lake Abert to keep it full, or maybe there's a lot of water, so we can ease back a little bit. But just keeping those things in mind going forward is going to be key as time goes on, and as we're seeing increased frequency of drought and heat and evaporation of water. It's just a really important thing to keep in mind. And advocacy and awareness, just telling friends and family, people like me who had no idea what Lake Abert was, and just explaining, just keeping it on the map basically, is a really important part of the, just about knowing about Lake Abert. And then continued monitoring. There's a very big need for volunteers in the coming years of surveying in the migratory period. And luckily for you, if you're interested, I wrote a protocol for my role this summer on how to survey birds for the layman. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can reach out to Onda or Ron, and can get you out there counting birds. And then I just would like to wrap up, talk about a few personal highlights from my time out there photographing with Ron out on the playa, and getting up close and personal with the birds was really fun. And then on my last survey, I had the blessing of seeing 15 bighorn sheep crossing the road right in front of me. And I snapped this picture, and also observing the phalarope murmurations, which is their flight pattern, as well as the fall surveys. I really enjoyed this picture of Abert Rim. I woke up one morning and there was like just a smattering of snow across it, and it was just so beautiful and contrasting to the intense heat and the summer surveys that I had. And then here is a video, if I can play it, of a murmuration. Not easy to video through a spotting scope, by the way. Best I can do. And then the left corner is black-necked stilt. Like I mentioned, my favorite bird out there. I think it's just really dramatic, and it has these pink legs and they just kind of strut around. And then that's the Schuylkill River, a bit up the road from Lake Abert. And yeah, that is it. Thank you everyone for listening, and if you have any questions, let me know.
So from my experience, I know that birders are a pretty devoted lot, and I'm just kind of curious about the tourism opportunities for birders out there, and if there's opportunities to expand that or promote that to increase awareness and visits to Lake Abert. I don't know if you comment on that.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. Just because, I mean, I don't know if I'm like a minority in this, but I did not even know it existed. And it's kind of an unassuming lake at first. It's very vibrant, but it's just tucked back in there. And I think that, yeah, people who, I mean, birders might all know about it because so many birds go there, but I think the general public would like love to see that and see these thousands of birds out there in the summer and go on a little road trip. And I think it would be great too for the local economies too, like Paisley and Lakeview. It's like these small towns that, yeah, like every stop through, you know, it is important to them. And yeah, I'd like to see a bit more tourism out there. Yeah.
Great. I've got whole questions there, but Ellie and Ron will be around, and also encourage others who haven't seen the book, who weren't here last night, to check it out. We got the author here who will be glad to sign. We're selling it for $40. It's a bargain. Again, thank you very much, Ellie. Okay, the last talk for Lakes Under Stress, this part of the session, is by Todd Jarvis with the Institute for Water and Watersheds of Oregon State, and his topic is Rethinking Laws, Rights of Nature, Roles of Leadership, and Reservoirs as Responses to Drying Lakes. So, Todd?
Great. Thank you, Haley. That was a great talk. Welcome back to Oregon. We need all the help we can get. At the Water Institute, I get a lot of calls and emails regarding water in the state. Most of them focus on why is my water well going dry? Or what can I do about nitrates in my well? Or where can I find a water witch? But last year, I started getting a lot of emails regarding the Lake Abert drying situation. And these weren't coming from just anybody. These were coming from seasoned professionals. What can we do about this? And I really didn't know. I mean, I've been to Lake Abert. I take students on field trips there all the time, but I really didn't know much about what were the responses that we have. And so what I did was a global survey of what's going on with respect to responding to impairments to water bodies, primarily with respect to desiccation of lakes. And it came down to about 6 different brackets of responses. And what I decided to call this was the wheel of desiccation. And so my presentation focuses on looking at these individual brackets of responses. And the first one that we come up to is engineering. Engineers love these things, these drying lakes, because these are big projects. The Aral Sea is a good example. This is a World Bank project where they decided to, instead of trying to save the whole lake, maybe they could save a corner of the lake. And so they built this dam on the one part of the Aral Sea. And what's remarkable is the lake has come back alive, and people can get boats out there, and the fisheries are starting to come back. But it's a far cry from saving the whole lake. The Salton Sea is undergoing the same type of saving a corner approach with respect to constructed wetlands at the Salton Seas in Southern California. And the goals are manyfold with respect to trying to save the lake or to actually try to keep other problems from emerging. The other one that is in the news a lot are bulk water transfers. If you have never seen this Valley of Peace initiative video, I strongly recommend you take a look at it. The area is in the news today. It's trying to build a pipeline from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. And it was the whole idea was to revitalize the peace initiatives in the Arava Valley in the Middle East. This is not limited to saving the Dead Sea strictly through the Red Sea. There was also projects that are looking at bringing water in from the Mediterranean, the MedDed project. One of my favorite projects is this North American Water, Power, and Alliance project. This thing started in 1964. It was generated by the Ralph Parsons Engineering Project. It was looking at moving water from Alaska to Mexico and the Great Lakes. Monstrous project. Today would be worth about $350 billion in construction costs. This project has been adapted by political action committees, primarily Lyndon LaRouche, through now is called the NAWAPA 21 project. And this idea is, let's move water from the Columbia River to California. And oh, by the way, maybe we can save some of the lakes along the way, like Lake Abert and Summer Lake. But these lakes, the goal is not necessarily to save the lakes per se. It's just a place to store water on its way to California. Another one that's been in the news is let's build a pipeline from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Salt Lake. All right. This is something that the Utah State Legislature looked at. This is something that Senator Mitt Romney was interested in exploring. The alignment that you see here on this map was to bring it from the Jordan Cove project, which is still being tossed around on the coast of Oregon, through a pipeline alignment associated with natural gas. And oh, by the way, the Great Salt Lake is right on the way. So let's just put the pipeline along the way. Project had a price tag of in the tens of billions of dollars, and some clever Brigham Young University engineering professors took a look at it and said it would only cost $300 million a year in power costs. The Salton Sea is not unique. It also has many different pipeline alignments that they're looking at bringing water in from the Sea of Cortez. And another very clever approach was to pump saline water from the oil and gas reservoirs in the Uinta basins, which is undergoing quite an oil boom right now, and move that water from the Uinta Basin to the Great Salt Lake. And it would only take tens of thousands of wells to do it, but what the heck? It's only money, right? The other one that is being tossed around now, which is looking at what are the options for keeping Lake Abert hydrated, if you will. And so some of the ideas that I've been hearing tossed around are perhaps we can build an off-channel reservoir to store water at higher elevations and slowly release the water to Lake Abert during the drying season. Another option is to explore perhaps modifying the underground reservoirs so that we can store water underground using managed recharge. The basalts in the area, the Steens basalt associated with the Columbia River basalt, these basalts are well known for being used for managed aquifer recharge. So this is just something that's underway. I don't think it's really gone much beyond just conceptual idea at this point. Back to the wheel of desiccation. Let's give it a spin and see where we end up. And we get to the business options. Now, the business options are really interesting. I think it's really simple. It's good business to just stop the diversions. And this is what LADWP has done with Mono Lake. They're still diverting water, but they've reduced the diversions to the point where the lake level still keeps the bridge that everybody's worried about, where the coyotes and wolves and et cetera can get out to where the birds are have their where they lay their eggs. Another very interesting, well, the other place that this is being done is in China on Lac Nor, in the western part of China in the Tarim Basin. And whatever Xi wants, Xi gets. He said, let's stop diverting the water. And guess what happened? The lake has revitalized. Okay. Water by rail. Yes, clever entrepreneurs located in White City, Oregon, have recognized that there is an opportunity here, especially given the extensive rail system throughout the United States, to move water by rail. All right. This idea that sounds crazy, but they've actually come up with many different opportunities. And probably the most recent one was there was the debate over what to do with water being released from the Upper Klamath Lake. Yep. Oregon Water Train was interested in providing 1,000 acre-feet of water per day by water through rail. Nevada's got an interesting concept underway now. Is maybe it's maybe we gave away too much water rights. And maybe we need to buy them back. And so they're exploring buying back water rights. I know that Oregon at least has it on the books as an option, but I have not heard of any case studies where water rights are being purchased. I think the idea has been at least mentioned in the Harney Basin, but no activity just yet. Back to the wheel of desiccation. Let's give it another spin and see where we end up. Special places. Lake Abert already is a special place. It's been designated as an area of critical environmental concern by the Bureau of Land Management. I think it does a great job of preserving a lot of the cultural resources in the area, but it really does very little with respect to keeping the water hydrated. And the reason why? Water is a state's issue, not a federal issue. The state of Oregon has decided to try to protect some special places. The one is the Metolius River, which is the state's first and only area of critical state concern. And the idea here was the Metolius River. If you haven't seen it, it's probably one of the bluest places that you've ever seen in your life with respect to discharging groundwater. And the idea was let's limit the development in this area and let's limit the groundwater development so that this springs can continue to discharge. The Aral Sea, we've come back to that. This has now become a special place because it is now the destination for disaster tourism. Haley, you mentioned something about tourism. Yeah, here it is, disaster tourism. And another place that is also undergoing a boom with respect to disaster tourism is Chernobyl. Get your tickets now. All right. Let's get back to the wheel of desiccation and look at the rights of nature. This is one of the more interesting ideas that's being kicked around. And this is the Klamath River, just in the past few years, has been designated a person through the tribes. The Magpie River in Canada has also been designated by the First Nations. And again, the idea behind these is obviously these are cultural resources, but the Magpie River, they decided this makes just good business sense for ecotourism. Lake Erie was also petitioned to be designated as a person. This is primarily to deal with the HAB situation. It didn't go anywhere with respect to the court, other than the judge thought it was a neat idea, but there were other options for Lake Erie. But again, I think it opens the door. These are some options to deal with respect to saving some of these special places. Citizens United, yes, lakes have been impacted by the Citizens United decision of 2010, where corporations have been also designated as persons. And also made famous by our friend, Senator Mitt Romney, when he was running for president. Corporations are people, my friend. A lake in Florida was suing to protect itself from development under the guise of being a corporation. Back to the wheel of desiccation. Let's see where we end up on this one. Leadership. This is an ongoing debate as to the role of leadership. The Great Salt Lake has designated through the governor's office a Great Salt Lake Czar. All right. So now we have water czars showing up in many different places. It's not a new idea. Patricia Mulroy is probably the most famous water czar in the world, and she carefully navigated water use and water storage in the Colorado River Basin. She did have a bias. She was in charge of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, but anyway, she garnered great support and respect from the seven the states that share the Colorado River Basin. There has been a water czar proposed for the Klamath Basin. This person is, they're still kind of kicking around the idea because this is somebody who is a lawyer with the federal government, and they think her plate is already pretty full. Now, the idea behind a water czar has been considered by the Oregon State Legislature. So the Joint Water Caucus, Ken Helm, Mark Owens, introduced a bill to create a water czar in Oregon. And if the idea is they recognize that the Oregon state water bureaucracies, there's 14 different agencies that have a connection to water management in the state, and it needed to figure out a way to get these different agencies that are very siloed to start cooperating. Water shepherds, this is a new idea. And the reason that it's a new idea is because all of a sudden we're starting to see some players donate water rights to lakes. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was the first. They said they were going to donate some of their water rights, normally dedicated to agriculture, to the Great Salt Lake. They were followed by Rio Tinto, one of the largest mining companies in the world that has a very large mine in the Salt Lake area. The trick with this, though, is if you know anything about Western water law, if you don't use that water, the next person down the road gets to use the water. And so the idea behind Water Shepherds, program that is being developed by Utah State University, is to figure out a way to keep the water in the stream if it's being donated. Makes sense. If you're going to ask questions, what are they doing? I really don't know. It's such a new program. They're trying to figure it out themselves. But I think there's an important lesson here for us in Oregon as we deal with water rights challenges in some of these areas that are undergoing droughts. Back to the wheel of desiccation. Let's see where we end up with today. Laws. This is really the interesting part of it, because when we start to think about the laws, most of the laws that we see with respect to these drying lakes focus on dust control. And we're not talking pocket change. There are some of these organizations that control dust that have spent upwards to $2 billion on dust control. Owens Lake is the largest source of dust in the United States, and this is where they've invested a huge amount of money to try to control the dust. And of course, the break in the drought has messed things up a little bit, because all of a sudden Owens Lake is refilling, and it's also destroying the dust control investments. The Salines Lake Act of 2022 is really an interesting thing. This is something, a very unique bipartisan effort to try to help the lakes in the Great Basin. Again, what it's looking at is providing about $25 million in $5 million tranches to the U.S. Geological Survey every year to study the lakes in the Great Basin. Sackett versus EPA. This is that Supreme Court decision with respect to wetlands. And it was the debate was whether or not somebody could develop private property in Idaho for their dream home. But what this did was it really upended the definition of a wetland. I think historically, with respect to some of these drying lakes or the lakes that are impaired, we've been relying on, well, they're close to wetlands, we have to protect them. But the definition of a wetland has been completely redefined. It's gone from adjacency to now it has to adjoin the water body. And it also has to be something that can be navigable. And it also has to be international. Now, all of a sudden, that changes using wetlands as a lever for protecting water bodies. The River Democracy Act, this is something that Senator Merkley and Senator Wyden have introduced, expanding the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And all of a sudden we see that they're introducing the notion of maybe we ought to put a lake or 2 or 10 into the River Democracy Act. So this is evolving. I think there's a lot of room with respect to adding lakes to this. It's my understanding that they're a little nervous about adding large lakes, but we know that everything is scalable, right? And Earth Systems Law. This is a whole new idea that is being tossed around globally, that given that humans have apparently changed the climate, don't say that out loud too often in different mixed audiences, but the idea is that the Anthropocene, if you believe in that, now makes humans part of the equation with respect to responding to some of these laws that with respect to water management, which have historically assumed stationarity, which we now know is complete nonsense. So there's a lot of options that are out there, but I don't think there's a whole lot of time. Thanks for your attention.
Questions? We want to take a spin on the wheel? Hey, Tammy, I guess I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks for that rundown, Todd. I think we're going to come back to you. Hey, Todd. I think we're going to come back to you as we work through some of those things with our discussions to get your advice and opinion. Thanks a lot.
General lake science. Okay. And then we'll have a coffee break after that. The first speaker is going to be Timothy Clark from Herrera Environmental Consulting, and he's going to be talking about making your lake data shine, dashboards for data visualization and interpretation in our Shiny.
Thank you. Hi, morning. It's great to be here. My name is Clark, or Timothy Clark. Too many different names. You can call me whatever you want. So I'm a data scientist. I help jurisdictions make long-term management plans for natural resources, and also a lake scientist. And so one of the things that's really important for me as I'm developing management plans in partnership with different local organizations is to better understand the data and better understand what we know about these systems. And oftentimes I get stuck behind messes of Excel tables and not be able to answer the questions I need very quickly. And so what I'm working towards here and describing here is trying to improve access to data through development of data dashboards. And I think that our Shiny is a fantastic pathway to get towards that because it is open source and free. So moving along, how do I move along? Okay, so as I go through this, I'm going to be focusing on a case study here for Thurston County Environmental Health Ambient Monitoring Program. Thurston County is located in, sorry, I just don't like how big that is. Okay, Thurston County is located in Washington. I know it's to the north, our neighbor to the north, but Thurston County is in South Puget Sound. So it has numerous lakes formed by glaciers, and then also has shellfish beds in the Puget Sound. And so they're really interested when it comes to protecting water quality. So can you please move? Okay. The mission of Thurston County Environmental Health is to achieve the highest well-being for its residents by protecting public health and environmental quality. So in this case, they're really interested in our lakes becoming, or are they already at risk for harmful algal blooms, and our shellfish beds threatening shellfish growing areas. To evaluate those questions, they have a lake monitoring program where they monitor 12 stations at 9 lakes monthly from May through October, doing sort of the typical approach of profiles every meter or so for temperature, dissolved oxygen, conductance, pH, and then also taking surface and deep water samples for nutrients, collecting chlorophyll A samples, doing Secchi depth, and then occasionally including E. coli and other parameters. Then they also include monitor streams, doing monthly monitoring throughout the year at 22 stream sites, and then quarterly monitoring at 11 more. Again, sort of the typical suite of parameters looking at temperature, dissolved oxygen, turbidity, TSS, pH, conductance, nutrients, fecal indicator bacteria, and occasionally others. They might have a special interest in metals here and there. But kind of their old standard process is, they collect the data, they input the data into a database, then they want to develop charts, tables, statistics, maybe in Excel, maybe in R. And then they write and format reports, and then they post those reports online, and they repeat the process. But oftentimes they just don't have the staff that's available to go beyond entering the data, because they're getting pulled in multiple directions. They are doing pollution identification and control programs in order to protect the shellfish beds. So this routine monitoring program can often get stacked up in just this database portion of it. And so external parties who might be interested in that, or internal natural resource managers, don't have access to this data, and the reports that are available are posted years ago. So an example of this is the 2021 Lake Water Quality Report, which is accessible on their website as a PDF. You can access it, scroll down. A lot of really nice information here. The paths and lakes, some facts around the lake, and then they show the trophic state index for the lake over time as a static graph. But I talked about a lot of different type of data, and all they're presenting here is the trophic state index, which is just a summary of the Secchi depth, total phosphorus, and chlorophyll A data. So what was happening for them is they were running out of time to actually prepare graphics and interpret them and to include them in the report for any kind of meaningful interpretation. So this onerous data reporting process is getting in the way of data interpretation and informed management. And so in early 2023, the Thurston County Environmental Health Department actually put out an RFP looking for a consultant to do this data reporting for them. And so I led a bid that said, yeah, we'll do that data reporting, but I'm not going to write any static PDFs. I would rather create an online application that does that reporting for you, and we'll be able to do so in perpetuity. So when you collect new data in 2024, that can go into this dashboard. And that way they don't have to get stuck in the grind of PDF report generation, which maybe you've been in there too, and it's a bit exhausting. So one of the tools that I learned when I first got out of grad school, I had used MATLAB and other coding software in grad school. But then I got to a local government. I was working for King County up in Washington, and they said, no, you need to learn R. It's free. We're not going to pay for any of these software licenses. And I fell in love with R. I've seen a lot of R plots today. I think a lot of people are kind of on that train. So that's great to see. And one of the things that I came along when I was learning more and more about R that came out probably maybe a decade ago, but has continued to prove over time, is R Shiny. And so R Shiny is a way of developing interactive applications for exploring data and performing analytical analysis using analytical tools. So I'm going to provide like a quick build example of a Shiny app development. So excuse me, I'm going to show some code, but it should be pretty straightforward. What I'm showing here first is on the upper left is bringing in some analytical packages in R. A package, the Shiny itself, to build the interactive tools, a data manipulation package, a plotting package, and then another package that allows us to make those plots interactive. And then this is the example. This is just like a header of the data set from Thurston County. So we have a site code for each of these monitoring sites for lakes, the time that it was collected. We have data going back to 1970. What parameter it is, what is the result, the measured value, the units, method detection limit, what depth it is, and the practical quantitation limit. So that's the data that we're working with here. So the first part of a Shiny app is just building a user interface, whatever people are interacting with. In this case, I'm allowing folks to select which parameter they want to display, what site they want to display, and then a date they want to highlight. And so those are those three kind of rows for inputs. And all I'm doing here, this is about 12 lines of code or so, and pulling in from the data set of, okay, you can select from whatever unique, all the unique list of sites. And though, let's see if this works. Yeah, so I did a bunch of recording of myself, and it's really interesting to watch the ghost mouse move around. But you can see that have all those sites are selected and can move around and collect. So that's sort of the user interface in this very simple app. And then we want to build the plot for it. And so in this case, I'm bringing that lakes data set, which is called lakes here. I'm filtering the parameter based off of what is the selected parameter from that drop-down list, filtering the site code from whatever is from that drop-down list that we input, and then also selecting all the data for that month that is selected. For the date that's selected, I want to also see historic data for that month. So if I'm looking at data from May 5th, 2013, I want to look at all data from May to see how this data compares. You might not be interested in that, and we could turn off that function, but just for now, I just want to use that for the display. And then I'm using ggplot here to develop this, putting the values on the x-axis and the depth on the y-axis, which is typical for our lake plotting, and then creating some points and lines on the graph. So it's a pretty quick amount of code, the UI, the user interface, and then the server interface. So the UI is the user interface, and the server is just that plotting software. And so this is just a video of kind of displaying that. So we're able to hover over, actually see each of these data points, get the information around them, hover over that past data, have that pop-up that comes up, and let's see how quickly I move around the mouse. Okay, and so I can move to different sites to highlight that black line. In this case, I selected a date that doesn't have any data associated with it. I jump over, and then there's that line, can see how that profile looked for temperature at this site, can switch between. So I don't want to spend too much time with this recording because it was very fun to do, but it's kind of strange to talk over. So getting back to the Thurston County case study for the ambient monitoring program, as I was developing this application for them, there's some really important things we needed to consider. So who are the data users? What are we actually generating this dashboard for? And what are their questions coming in? So some of these options that I talked about with them are we looking, is this something that we're building for the lake residents themselves? Their questions are going to be, how's my lake? Are conditions changing? Are we building this for research institutions, for Evergreen College? Their uses are pretty varied. They kind of just want to get towards the data, but maybe have a visualization tool to help them understand these systems without having to download all the data and rebuild it. Then there's the internal users, the natural resources and surface water managers, both within Thurston County, then within all the different cities, like Olympia within Thurston County. They might be coming into the calling up the ambient monitoring program with random questions from their boss or from residents of, hey, we heard there's an issue going on in Summit Lake. What's been happening here? And so to be able to quickly pull up that information, look to see, are we seeing trends over time? Are conditions getting worse in Summit Lake? Is this just anecdotal evidence from somebody at the lake, and we actually have some data to better understand these situations? And also, this is something that can be helpful for prioritizing management action. So to actually sit in a room with a environmental manager and go through all the data that's available without having to flip through a PDF, and actually be able to quickly jump through different lakes or streams and different parameters of interest. And then also another set of data users can be consultants. And so I really want, when I'm coming in and I'm trying to understand the lake to help develop a lake management plan, I need to do a deep dive in all the existing data to understand what are the processes that we see that are going on. So with Thurston County, we determined that the audience or user is really going to be these internal county data users who are going to be peppered with questions from the public and peppered with questions from consultants and from their supervisors. So not necessarily building that external public-facing application, because that requires a much more exquisite development process to understand what are the questions actually are coming from the public and what is the best way for them to ingest the information. And so Thurston County, based off these discussions that we were having, have actually decided to do an additional route to develop a public-facing data dashboard, which is going to be much more accessible than a bunch of what I think is fantastic data displayed on a chart, but to help them go beyond just looking at the data, but providing meaningful interpretation of it. So what are the questions this data dashboard are going to answer? So some are just, what are the most recent data? What does it look like from all our monitoring data that they completed in 2023? They also wanted to know, are there any statistically significant long-term trends? This is part of their long-term reporting that was in their plan and their QAP, so they weren't having opportunity to do. So they wanted to have some opportunity to do trend analysis. And they also just want to have, quick snapshots of what are the lake's trophic state. Are they eutrophic? Are they returning towards it? Also, it was really important for us to identify the questions the dashboard is not going to answer, such as, are these trends meaningful? Is a change in phosphorus at 0.01 parts per billion, though the p-value is 0.02, is that a meaningful trend? That's not what this dashboard is looking to answer, and that's where we need to have lake scientists do that interpretation. So this is to help get them to knowing that information and then helping guide decisions and management actions from that. So it's not answering what needs to be done either to protect or restore water quality, nor is it a public health information tool. It's not telling people whether it's safe to swim or touch the water. There are external programs for those kind of risk communication pathways. So what we wanted to have in this tool is basic visualization of the data with pop-ups to understand what is the lab sample number that's associated with this data, what are the results. Wanted to have mapping to be able to understand the spread of these sites, to have interactive statistics to be able to do temporal trends with shifting your site selection, the parameter selection, shifting the start year and end year of trends, to have index calculation to be able to get towards that trophic state, and then also have a tool to download the data, because right now, all that data that exists for Thurston County ambient program is on an internal server. And so what we're able to do through a hosted application is actually give people access to download the data, because we're already holding the data in order to develop these visualizations. And so this is the landing page for this app that we developed for Thurston County. For the lakes, we've developed a similar one for the stream program. The landing page is this map, so they can quickly, if they have a question and people need to zoom over to a certain lake, they can click on it, zoom in, zoom out, scalable. We have pop-up that shows to go pop in to look at the trophic state for that selected lake from the map. Also can be navigated on the left-hand panel. So let's say we're interested in Black Lake here. We hit the trophic state index and look at trophic state over time, hover over these points to see what they are, have the bands of the different trophic state classifications. And then at the bottom, additionally, we have discussion of trends. So for TSI, total phosphorus has remained the same. We don't have a statistically significant trend. Same for chlorophyll, and then Segi depth, we actually don't have inadequate data. And so these are all auto-generated statistical analyses. And then on the bottom left, we can actually shift between what is the selected site and look to see what are the trends across these multiple different lakes in the lake trophic state. So this is probably the most publicly accessible piece of it, is this map, and then actually getting to the trophic state index. So then kind of the meat of this, which is really helpful for that data exploration, is to go look at this data visualization and trends. And so with this, we have these plots over time, or plots with each of these plots is a given month. So we have May, June, July, all the way through October, because that's our monthly period. And then the selected week is shown in black, or the selected monitoring date, and then past data shown behind it. Again, can select between different sites and select different years to highlight for their monthly monitoring program. In this case, this is looking at, can't tell which lake this is. Summit Lake, which is a deep lake. And as you can see, this is water temperature. So we can see the formation of stratification and then the breakdown, and then also jump over to be looking at dissolved oxygen. Are we seeing low oxygen at depth as well? And as you can see, first in May, we actually see that positive heterograde curve. And that's pretty consistent from year to year. And then actually the decrease of oxygen at depth over the course of the summer. And another thing that we have as a tab here is to be able to look at long-term trends. And so for this, there's a lot of information here. And so this is why it's more of that internal data user. But it can actually have this, that interpretation of what these trends are, but changing the depth range of what we're looking at. Right now, this is unweighted based off depth. It's not volume weighted. And so what I offered here is the ability to kind of select a depth range to be evaluating trends, and then also can adjust. So now I'm changing it to deep. And so are there trends in deep water dissolved oxygen, and have that interpretation at the bottom there. That text is changing dynamically based off of the selections and what is a result of the statistical analysis being done. So then I'm changing around. Yeah, and so I feel like I'm kind of locked into whatever I played around with here. I offered something to do log scale, because like total phosphorus is best displayed on log scale oftentimes. You can look to see changes in phosphorus. And I think in this case, we're seeing there's a significant increase in phosphorus over time. Yeah, and so additionally, we have a few other mapping plots for looking at trophic state indices over time. Oh, this is the data downloader. So it will select one or multiple sites to download the data, select which parameters want to be downloaded. So just like a really, sort of simple data access point, and able to download it and get to that raw data set, which is shown here. So I think that's really important. It's great to be able to show graphics, but also give people access to the raw data set for their own interpretation. And then we have a few more maps that are just showing trophic state index over time, and then another map that will show trends across multiple sites, which is shown here. So able to select a parameter and see, where are we seeing increasing trends statistically, and where are we seeing decreasing trends statistically. I'm going to go ahead and jump out of this. So during construction of this application, we hosted our code on GitHub. It also could be hosted on other like code sharing development site like Bitbucket. And we can run this development app internally within our studio interface. And then after construction, we can deploy the app to CyanoHABs on a cloud server. At higher pay levels, you can sort of have your own server running to host these applications. They can be embedded within an existing website, or they can be standalone websites. And then, as with all software, there's going to be bugs that come up. And so tracking and fixing those can be done within GitHub. And then all that Thurston County needs to do is track those bugs, let us know, and we can come and fix them, and then also update the data source. And so there's sort of two pathways for that. We can either have the data be hosted within the application itself, or we can connect with a data query API if they have an externally accessible database. Quickly, I'll just discuss this Shiny Cloud. This is a place that we can store these applications. They have different pay ranges. Free, this is what I used for a long time at King County, because it costs $0. You can host up to 5 applications, but there's up to $350 per month where you can host an unlimited amount of applications. There's higher processing speed that's available, can have custom domain names, can have many users for one account. Right now, Herrera is using the starter package. So we have up to 25 applications and up to 100 hours. And I think eventually we're going to be upgrading to basic because we're using these applications for a variety of purposes for stormwater monitoring and stream monitoring as well. So there's some resources, a resource you can come to, because I don't imagine you want to jot these all down, is me. I have cards over there, and if you want to come play with the application, I can put it on the dashboard or on our computer over there. It's also hosted there. I have the source code that's available. It's on GitHub, that's publicly available. So come in and make it better. And that's kind of the vision of this stuff, is for us to work together for allowing data to drive decisions. So stay shiny out there. Thank you. I'll let you know what I'm doing here.
So we can maybe have time for one quick question. There is one.
Yeah.
It's great that we're seeing more Shiny applications. At DQ, we use Shiny a lot for a lot of our data displays and distribution. One question I have though is about, our versions continually get updated, package versions continually get updated. Is there a structure in place? Because you would think that a lot of them are backwards compatible, but they aren't always.
Yeah.
And so what type of maintenance or kind of regular check-in is needed to make sure that the app is continuing to work and updated or modified as needed as new versions come out?
Yeah, so that I've come across that problem, and luckily there's a lot of people who have discovered solutions that are for that, and they actually built a package around that called PackRat, in which you're able to create the list of the packages that are necessary as well as those versions. And so it actually has a little script, and so it runs before when someone's installing this application, and will pull in all those different versions. I'm pretty sure it's PackRat. I know that there was another version. There's two packages, and one is sort of the one that came before and the one that came after. PackRat is a fun name, so that's the one that's popping in my head, but I can confirm that and get back to you. But I've been using that version in order to help track those libraries and make sure we have consistent language, and also wherever possible, using the package and : for all functions. Otherwise, there's too many functions have the same name. All right, but we can talk more about that later. Thank you.
There's a question chat too, so maybe you can just address that on your own. It looks like someone would like the script, so. Okay. All right, so the second talk is going to be by Evan Bredeweg from OSU. He's going to be talking about the dark underside of floating solar panels using interactive runs of C-equal W2.
All right, thank you all. And yes, we're going to have another data talk. So I hope you guys are all hanging in there and staying caffeinated through this. I'm working at this project as part of Yvonne Nares-Mendy's lab, looking at the potential for floating solar installations on hydroelectric reservoirs. So these photovoltaic arrays are something that they're just large installations of solar panels in hydroelectric reservoirs. They can be on a variety of water bodies, but the interest around hydroelectric reservoirs is that there's a lot of potential transmission capacity already installed, and there are areas that have already been potentially impacted by human development. So these are often abbreviated as FPVs, but in the context of this, I'm just focusing on reservoir systems, though they have been explored in marine systems or estuaries. So here's kind of a visualization of what these can often look like. Is they are just these installations of panels on rafts. These can often be more or less built up depending on the kind of environment that they're installed in. Some have been installed on membrane surfaces on the water so that they're actually very close to the water surface, while others are kind of up on these floating racks. And then they often have transmission capacity that is then attached back to the shore. And then there's a series of mooring that happens under the water to make sure that they're not floating off. So there's a lot of excitement around these kinds of installations, particularly from the engineering community, because of a couple of different aspects around their design. The first is increased solar efficiency. So photovoltaic panels do their best when they're in a comfortable human temperature range. When they get too hot, their efficiency drops off. So the thought is if we keep these near the surface of water, that they're going to be maintained in a cooler environment, and they'll produce more power with the amount of sun that they receive. Additionally, they don't have, installing them on water, we're not having competing use over land. You're not going to be removing farmland or removing areas for development by putting solar panels on them. So they're an area that's kind of not under the same kind of competition. And from an environmental side, there's a lot of discussion about these reducing evaporation on reservoirs, which, as we've heard earlier this morning, issues of reservoir drying is a rather permissive issue. However, each one of these kind of have their own dark side. So while yes, you're increasing solar efficiency by using the lake's buffering effect on temperature, it also means that you're having warm solar panels that are in close proximity to the surface of the water, which then could be impacting the temperature of the reservoir. And while you're sparing land, installation on water bodies is another competing use on a system that already has a variety of user groups and one more piece of infrastructure to maintain in these reservoirs. And while evaporation reduction is good for conservation of water in the reservoir, you're also going to be changing the kind of incoming solar radiation, which could be affecting algal growth, as well as changing water cycling in the environment. So this idea of FPV has kind of really started to take off back in 2018. This was an initial report that really kind of posited some of the benefits and issues around how to deploy these. And even back in 2018, as a part of this publication, they had this kind of diagram walking through some of the issues and challenges around FPV installation. And while this is a bit of a busy graph, the thing I want to point out is that while a lot of these issues are challenges that engineers are excited to kind of figure out the best solution for in terms of resiliency ties to the to grid, or how to maintain a maintenance schedule by boat, there's only a few of these that are really ties into the environment, things that are around the shading, potential changes in nutrient inputs if there's a collection of bird droppings, shading, and changes of temperature in the reservoir. And so while there's many of these challenges that we're working on engineering our way out of, these ones that are impacting this environment are potentially going to be harder issues to really understand fully. So trying to understand how to take this idealized version of these FPV arrays and bring this into a real situation with panels on real water bodies, there's a lot of groundwork that we want to try to lay so we understand what we're getting ourselves into. And so this is a larger project that we're a part of that's trying to understand different facets of challenges to deploying floating solar panels in reservoirs. So this Aqua PV project has kind of three different groups. One looking at the technical and then the economic issues around these arrays. There's another group looking at the regulatory issues. And then at Oregon State, our group has been focused on environmental impacts, specifically trying to understand what kind of environmental response we might see with large deployment of these arrays. So the way that we really focused in on trying to understand this, particularly since we're not building test arrays to deploy, is to try to dive into the functioning of the reservoir, looking at the way that the lake's going to stratify and all of the physics that involves. So our approach to do this has been to take a reservoir and move this into a simulated space using a mechanistic simulation. So these mechanistic simulations try to recreate a lot of the physics and chemistry that occurs within reservoirs so that we can kind of understand potential trajectories into the future. We're not the first really to take this road. There's been some other work. This is a project that was done in England using MyLakes, which is another mechanistic model to try to look at how a reservoir would change with different effects of shade and blocking of wind that might be occurred with these panels. They looked at responses of such as surface water temperature at different combinations of these two variables. They also looked at things like changes in evaporation rate, again, seeing this reduction in evaporation rate with increasing coverage. And they also looked at things like stratification. There's another project that has been worked on in Germany where they partnership. They partnered a mechanistic simulation using the GLM, the General Lakes model, alongside a test deployment on this small lake. And then they were able to tweak some of these forcing variables around incoming solar radiation and wind sheltering to try to get their their GLM simulation to match their observed values as best as possible. And they also dove a little bit more into specific localized shading that you would see under these panels when you have some of these racked arrays. But both of these modeling approaches so far have used one-dimensional models. So this is an illustration from the GLM model, but MyLakes works largely in the same way, where they kind of take all the different aspects of the ecology and physics of the lake, and they're really focusing in on the vertical component, this kind of a depth aspect of the response. So that's that one dimension that these models are focusing in on. And while this is really an easy way to get started, it is also a pretty gross simplification of some of these water bodies. And it means that you're having a uniform impact of these FPV arrays on the entirety of the surface water. So we've looked to move to more dimensional in this modeling space using C=W2. This was a model that was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and again has a lot of these mechanical and chemical aspects to the functioning of the reservoir. And what's really important for our interest in doing this in reservoirs is that these are often water bodies that have quite a gradient of depth across their length. And the C=W2 model has been widely applied in a variety of water bodies, so that there's a lot of kind of literature and support for its application. So the way we took this on, C=W2 was written in Fortran, which is a very computationally effective programming language, but has kind of all of its own input files and control files that have been developed for these modeled runs. These include things like bathymetry, meteorological forcing data, as well as hydrologic inputs. But rather than try to dig into the Fortran code itself, we again moved into R. I enjoyed the talk, bringing up R right before this. We used R as a way to interface with this simulation software. So we formatted the C=W2 model with standardized outputs, and then allowed R to act like a super user to modify some of these global forcing variables like shading and changing the wind surface interaction, the wind sheltering coefficients, using that and then allowing R to run the simulation model. After one run of this model, R was able to harvest in some of the response variables from this. And then we repeated this loop of iterations for a whole suite of different FPV array sizes. And so the end of this is that we are able to create a database of responses with increasing sizes of FPV array. So as an example of what this might look like, so this DeGray reservoir is a kind of classic C=W2 model that's included with the download package. And this is in Arkansas, and the figure, I realize that it's very small, but on the bottom of this slide, there's a image showing the way that bathymetry is summarized in this. So each one of these segments is a kind of column of water moving up the reservoir, and the color in the kind of the redder that cell, the wider that segment is across the width of the reservoir. So I'm going to flip this onto the other side, and we can look at an animation of what this looks like. So here we have 3 different animations showing the water temperature at different depths along these different segments in DeGray Reservoir. The topmost animation is a reference model that's not shaded. The middle animation is one where there's an array that's covering 30% of the reservoir. And the lowest animation is a simulation with around 50% coverage of an FPV array. Again, each one of these simulations is just modifying shading and wind sheltering for those segments that are covered up by this FPV array. And we have a color grade showing temperatures of these different areas. And as we move into summer, you can already kind of see that there's a change in the temperature of surface water across the reservoir for the increasing amount of coverage. And you also will see that the deep water is actually cooler than the reference model on the top. I'll let this kind of play out. I realize it is not the fastest slide, but and I realize since it is also quite small, the color grade is a 0 to 35 degrees Celsius. And even as you move into the fall, while the surface water temperatures kind of go back to a little bit more normal, you'll see that the deep water is still much cooler in that higher FPV coverage scenario. All right, so we've gotten our handle around how to do this kind of mechanistic simulation of recreating this floating solar panels on these reservoirs, but really this is only one piece of a larger picture of how different reservoirs might respond. The larger climate around where a reservoir is, such as regional climate, or as well as things like the physical structure of some of these sites, are all going to kind of change the effectiveness of these models to simulate FPV array, as well as looking at how those reservoirs are going to respond. So the next piece of this was leaning on C=W2's kind of larger adoption base. So it's been pretty well adopted in the literature as well as through the Army Corps of Engineers work. So we've tried to collect a variety of these reservoir simulations so that we can run each one of these through this kind of stress testing scenario to look at how they would respond to FPV arrays. So on this figure, we have two different time zones. One is during the summer and one is during the winter. And on the x-axis, we have the percent coverage of FPV arrays on a reservoir. And on the y-axis, we have a relative percent change in each one of these variables. So this first set of plots is looking at the mean surface water temperature. And in summer, we see the same basic trend across all these different reservoirs, where as you increase the amount of shading and our FPV arrays, that you'll see a decrease in the average surface water temperature. In winter, we see largely the same trend, though there's a little bit more variability in this response. If we switch to the mean outflow temperature, in the summer, we once again see there's general decrease, but there's a bit of noise when you get to these really high percent coverages of the reservoirs. And in the winter, there's even more variability, with some reservoirs seeing dramatic increases in the temperature of outflowing water, potentially where you're interrupting the stratification of the winter lake. So the next one we're going to look at is the vertical profile, the average temperature of the vertical profile at the most downstream segment of the reservoirs. And here again, we see this kind of variability with a general trend where in the summer, we're generally decreasing temperatures, and in the winter, we're getting quite a bit of noise in the response. And then looking at the thermocline depth, since many of these lakes are often stratified in the summer, there's a variety of noise in the response to thermocline depth. And in the winter, we didn't really get a response since many of these lakes were well mixed during the winter. So there's no point of comparison to reference that against. So instead of just looking at thermocline depth, we can also look at the Schmidt stability index, which is a measure of strength of stratification. And in this, we see a whole suite of different responses. Some within the summer months showing a dramatic increase in their strength of stratification, while some are reducing their strength of stratification. And in the winter, it's a whole different ballgame. For those models that were included dissolved oxygen in their simulation, there is, again, quite a bit of noise in the response, where some reservoirs are increasing their dissolved oxygen in the lake during the summer, while some are dramatically decreasing. And in the winter, again, quite a bit of variability. So it's really easy to want to try to explain why some reservoirs are acting in certain ways. But while we have this set so far, we're really looking to build out more models that are included in our study. So we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers and USGS to access additional reservoir models so that we can kind of have a wider coverage of this wider coverage of reservoirs. And with that, once we have a better regional coverage of this approach, we're hoping to dive a little bit more into what variables are potentially shaping the response of some reservoirs. So, however, we're still working in a simulated space, and that has kind of the pros and cons. So C=W2 is a great resource, but there is all of the, we're relying on the processes that are programmed into that approach. So there's been some work that have looked at how well C=W2 functions in scenarios outside of that when it was fit on. And the reality is it doesn't always do the best. If you're trained on a dry year, it will do best on dry years. If it's trained in a wet year, it'll do best in a wet year. So there's a lot of, and then this approach that we're taking of changing forcing variables to simulate FPV is not a use case that people have used on C=W2. So there is still this question of if it's really capturing all of the effects on the reservoir. So really, we need a test deployment of an FPV array on a reservoir that we have a model for and seeing how well we're capturing that. So at the same time, this is a very valuable approach because we're able to very quickly iterate through different array sizes in a variety of different locations to try to understand at least what might happen so that when these arrays do get deployed, we at least know what variables to pay attention to into the future. And we're hoping to develop a web tool for energy developers so that they can understand which areas of the country might be more or less suitable for this kind of a deployment. And also having that inform the environmental monitoring plans that they put into place as they are writing up their ESA or their EIS. But I think the thing that I really want to impress upon this is that there's a lot of complexity in the ecosystem responses, and that while these are highly engineered systems, there are still a lot of intricacies in terms of the environmental response for a given reservoir. And with that, I'll take any questions if there's still time. Thank you.
Maybe one question if there's any.
Thanks everyone for making it to the end of the sessions for Oregon Lakes Association this year. And it wouldn't be an OLA conference without a HABs session. So that's the penultimate session for the year. My name is Dan Sobota. I'm with Oregon DEQ. I'm in the Watershed Management section, headquartered out of our Portland office. I work a lot with HABs within the agency, coordinate a lot of work. And I'm going to lead the session off with a talk. And then we have a great slate of presenters to follow up. So thanks, everyone. And Yvonne, you're going to keep time for me, I think. Cool. All right. So today, what I'm going to talk about is just present some data that we've been collecting from the Upper Deschutes and Little Deschutes watersheds or subbasins on monitoring cyanobacteria blooms and associated water quality in the area. And let's see here if I can do this correctly here. Just for some context, you know, I work for DEQ, so we work a lot with Clean Water Act related issues. And as of the latest integrated report, which gets submitted to the EPA every 2 years, we have a number of listings for what I consider algal productivity related water quality impairments within the area, and also specifically to lakes and reservoirs. And work in the area really has been ongoing for 20 plus years, probably much longer than that. And so it's a continuing issue, and we're trying to work towards building water quality management plans, something called TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, that'll be useful for the area. Let's check here. Looks like there's a major echo coming through. So yeah, sorry, Kurt, that might be on your end. Sorry. So for the project that I'm going to talk about today, we've been trying to collect data, update water quality data that will be available for management decisions that are coming up, scheduled to be completed within the next 6 or 7 years in the area, and also being able to try to test the capacity of some of the new satellite data and methods that are coming out to detect blooms, kind of ground truthing that within the area. And what I'm going to talk specifically about today, you know, I have lakes and reservoirs in my title, but what sifting through the data and sifting through the information that we've been compiling, I think it's a little bit simpler to focus in on a few water bodies within the area. And I'm going to focus today on two lakes that we have the longest record of monitoring most recently, and that's going to be Odell Lake and Crescent Lake, which are adjacent to each other in the upper portions of the upper and middle Deschutes subbasins. I think most people here may be familiar with these lakes, but they, they formed, they're deep glacially formed lakes. They formed after the last ice age about 10, 12,000 years ago. They're very deep, about 300 feet deep, a little bit less than that. And they're, again, very close to each other, have very similar physiographic settings, but have very different kind of productivity regimes. Odell Lake has listings for harmful algal blooms and other algal growth related water quality impairments. And you can see the record here. I've tried to display this, the record of Oregon Health Authority harmful algal bloom recreational advisories over the past 20 years. And you can see that there's actually it's been fairly cyclical, where we have kind of a 5 or 6 year period of consistent bloom advisories, and then 5 years or less of lack of advisories. And I'll come back to that at the end, hopefully. And then contrast that with Crescent Lake, which is been classified classically as ultra oligotrophic or oligotrophic, so very clear water. If anyone's been there, it's it's almost as blue as Crater Lake, I would say. So I think it's interesting comparing Odell Lake, which has been classified at least since the middle of the 20th century as mesotrophic to eutrophic, to one that is consistently oligotrophic, but they're, again, very close to one another. Within the 5 years we've been monitoring, we've actually seen very different conditions interannually, especially in Odell. Actually, Crescent, I guess, has been pretty consistently clear, again, kind of living up to the oligotrophic or ultra oligotrophic classification. Whereas with Odell, within the first 2 years of our monitoring, 2019 and 2020, we had very significant superficial cyanobacteria blooms that were apparent, and we had actually harmful algal bloom advisories issued for elevated microcystin values above the state recreational threshold of 8 micrograms per liter. But over the past 3 years, during the same time period, and these blooms historically typically occur from about mid-July to like early August. And when they occur in sequence, it's very regular when they occur. But over the past 3 years, we have not seen those superficial blooms or those elevated microcystin values above the recreational use thresholds. So what we've been doing, again, since 2019, within these lakes, and actually, as I mentioned, some other lakes as well, Crane Prairie Reservoir, Lava Lake, over actually a shorter time period, I guess. But we've been monitoring, we've been instrumenting sondes at fixed locations just for security, both within Crescent and Odell at Sunset Cove and at the resort at Crescent Lake. Fixed depths. We've been taking continuous data generally from spring through fall. First year was a little bit more constrained just because of some timing of getting some equipment out. And we've also been collecting biweekly nutrient and at least since 2020 microcystin samples within these water bodies. And then we've also had the opportunity to do some vertical profile sampling just to get a sense of, we've been sampling the surface, but we know that these lakes strongly stratify during the summer. So we want to get a sense of some of the vertical profiles as well. And we've done that so far in 2019 and 2021, and we have plans to do that again, hopefully this coming year. And then we also have been compiling cyanobacteria abundance estimates derived from the Sentinel-3 cyan project, EPA run through NASA. And so what I want to do now is basically just show a series of graphs of the types of data that we've been collecting, and then maybe talk about how we're starting to interpret that in the context of other work that's been done in the area over the past several decades, and how that might fit in. Maybe not drawing strong conclusions, but I think it's really useful to look at the time series data and just get a sense of the difference between the water bodies as well. And so for each of these graphs, again, I'm going to be showing time series and vertical profile graphs. So on your left side, you're going to be seeing Crescent Lake consistently, and on the right side is going to be Odell Lake. And on the x-axis is either going to be date for the superficial plots or the value for the vertical profile. plots. So just looking, starting to look just at surface water temperature, we can see that, across the 5-year period, and although this has been encompassing different El Nino and La Nina cycles and different kind of micro variations and annual climate, we're seeing some pretty consistent patterns with surface temperatures that are coming up to maybe a little bit short of either a little bit over 20 degrees. 1 second, I need to zoom in here a little bit. Oops, that's the wrong thing to do here. So yeah, a little bit over 20 degrees in the surface waters, and again, it's just generally slightly warmer at Odell, but not by a significant amount. If you look at sorry, I'm getting a little flustered here. If you look at the vertical profile data, and unfortunately we only have 2019 for Crescent Lake, but it's reasonable to assume that's similar in 2021. We can see, again, pretty strong stratification, and this fits with where we expect to see a thermocline for these water bodies based on the Oregon Lakes the Oregon Lakes Atlas information that's available online. We can see even, we're showing here, across here, 2021 is a little bit warmer, and this may actually be the heat dome effect, because the heat dome happened in late June of that year, and so it's a little bit ahead in terms of the surface water temperatures, but still showing a pretty consistent stratification pattern. And again, just a reminder, 2019 was a bloom year, and 2021 was a non-bloom year. If we look at dissolved oxygen concentration data, again, we're seeing, and these are expressed in terms of minimum daily dissolved oxygen data that are calculated for the based on the SON data. We can see that in general, the minimum values tend to be lowest at Odell, which again fits within this concept of being more eutrophic or mesotrophic to eutrophic, whereas the surface concentrations at Crescent seem to be above, even minimum daily above saturation values. And when we look at the vertical profile dissolved oxygen, again, kind of classic differences between these two oligotrophic versus eutrophic systems, whereas we're seeing that positive heterograde curve actually within Crescent Lake, showing a little bit of bump productivity around the thermocline. Within Odell, it's a little bit different between the 2 years. We were seeing during we're calling the bloom year, one of the bloom years, we're seeing a pretty basic clinograde pattern, maybe slightly a pattern holding up the metal limnion of dissolved oxygen decline with depth. Whereas in the year where we're not seeing superficial blooms, we're seeing a pretty strong positive heterograde curve. But I do want to note that for both years, that with depth, dissolved oxygen drops off to be about 80% at depth, which is much lower than our state standards for dissolved oxygen within Odell. Whereas, at least from the data that we have from 2019, Crescent Lake seems to be maintaining a pretty strong saturated profile with depth. We can do the same with pH, just again to explore some of the data. And here, this dashed line represents the state standard for pH. And again, we can see that maximum daily pH values presented here seem to be consistently above the state standard, even in years where we're not seeing superficial blooms within Odell. Whereas pH values, again, are kind of what we'd expect to see maybe in an oligotrophic system within Crescent. I'm going to show the vertical profile again, similar type of positive heterograde curve, especially in the non-bloom year within Odell. Sorry, I'm on the wrong slide here. But again, similar pattern during a superficial bloom where we're seeing pretty high pH values, again, above our state standards for pH. And we're actually seeing that in both bloom and non-bloom years. Go through chlorophyll A. Again, I think this just demonstrates again that we're seeing more productivity within Odell Lake, but it's consistent across time, even in years where we're not seeing we're not seeing superficial blooms, apparent superficial blooms of cyanobacteria. And a little bit harder to see, I guess. Should maybe show a little bit deeper purple, but you can see again, even in our non-bloom surface bloom year, we're seeing a pretty strong peak in chlorophyll A right around the thermocline, which again is potentially is interesting. And this is characteristic of, in other lakes, this is often seen as cyanobacteria, oscillatoria we'll set up here, but I'm not going to show the phycocyanin data, but because it's a little bit squirrely in terms of the how the probe was reading it, but I'm not sure it's actually cyanobacteria that are setting up here. We need to have more samples to confirm that. With phycocyanin, I do want to point out that again, in the bloom years here, and this is hidden by the by the crease, but bloom years, we are seeing peaks in phycocyanin that are apparent from our probes. And that's also borne out within, we have some values for microcystin that were collected. We didn't have a time series the first year, but we did have some grab samples that were above our state standard that within Odell. So that does match up with seeing a superficial bloom of cyanobacteria. And I do want to note also that, consistently lower at detection level at Crescent, and also in what we consider our non-bloom years at Odell, or non-superficial bloom years, we are still getting hits for microcystin, but just not above our threshold for listing. In comparison to cyan, the Sentinel-3 satellites, we see the phycocyanin data seem to match up pretty well with the estimates from the satellites. And then we can also look at some of the nutrient data that we've been collecting as well. And again, characteristic, this is total nitrogen. So everything in the water column that expresses nitrogen, whether that's phytoplankton or organic or inorganic forms. You can again see on a log axis, we're seeing that, we're seeing generally higher levels of total nitrogen within Odell versus Crescent. We're seeing very low levels of inorganic nitrogen. I'm showing here nitrate, but ammonia is showing a similar, if not more extreme pattern. You can look at total phosphorus. Total phosphorus is kind of all over the map, especially in Odell, very low levels, again, in Crescent. And these kind of fit with long-term averages of total phosphorus that have been observed at Odell. But what's interesting is you break it apart into inorganic phosphorus. There is apparently a slightly seasonal pattern where you see elevated phosphate during the spring months and gets drawn down during the summer. And this is pretty characteristic of what we think is a diatom bloom that's occurring. You can see the same thing with silica that's being basically released later in the summer as the diatom bloom tends to crash, and you have cyanobacteria become more dominant, especially during our quote unquote surface bloom years. And I should also note that it's also really interesting that within Crescent, the silica values in general are about an order of magnitude higher than what we see in Odell, and that's consistent across years, which is also characteristic of, well, it's still interpreting what that means for diatom, I guess, production. So a lot of data, we're still interpreting a lot of it, but what I do want to say is that a lot of the information we are collecting is consistent with some of the earlier work that's been done in Odell, where especially during the superficial bloom years, where it looks like there could be aquatic community influences on the prevalence of harmful algal blooms, specifically related to kokanee dynamics. And I want to point back to that cyclical behavior of the harmful algal bloom advisories that I mentioned at the forefront, where it seemed like it was on a 4 to 5 year cycle. And it does seem to match fairly well with kokanee life cycle patterns and potential boom bust dynamics with kokanee populations. And we've also looked at this, overlaid this with information on El Nino and La Nina events and climate cycles, and that doesn't seem to match up quite as well. So I think that that's something that we can continue to expand upon and look across years. But I do also want to point out that even when we're seeing years that we don't have apparent superficial cyanobacteria blooms or elevated microcystins, we are still seeing water quality impairments to dissolved oxygen and pH. So it is persistent across years, whether or not we're seeing the surface blooms. And this is just, again, the beginning of a process. We're hoping to integrate this along with the data that we're collecting on Crane Prairie, Lava Lake, and some other systems, which are very different than Odell and Crescent, to better kind of work towards coming up with what management plans are necessary to address the blooms. So with that, I want to thank a lot of folks that have contributed to the work over the years. And I think we have some time for questions. I guess 2 minutes for questions. We're going to move on. Right, Theo, looks like you have one.
A lot of data now. Two things. In Detroit Reservoir, there has been little to no bloom activity for the last few years. Same thing as you saw in Odell, a decrease.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very, very different location. The other thing is about fish. So I was writing something when you started talking about kokanee, so I didn't really hear that. But I know from Joe Eilers that he suspects that fish stocking could be a problem in Odell. So what are the differences between fish stocking in Odell and Crescent, and what are your thoughts about the fish?
Well, I
Sort of consuming zooplankton and then giving an opportunity for the blooms.
And I'm not going to speak specifically to Joe's paper, since he did a lot of work in this in the mid 2000s. But the idea, there's both a top-down effect and a probably increased release of phosphorus from excretion from the food web that could make that available to cyanobacteria growth. In terms of stocking, you know, both have been stocked historically. Odell was, you know, fish have been introduced in Odell since the 1940s. Kokanee, lake trout, other species as well. Some have taken, some have not. The kokanee have become self-sustaining within Odell. Whereas, as far as I'm aware, they're not in Crescent, although I may have to refer to ODF&W about if that's entirely accurate. Odell is a trophy lake trout fishery. It's like the largest, I think the state record came out of Odell. One question for me, and there's also been, you know, there's an extensive record of human development in the mid 20th century, resorts, roads, railroads that have been put in. And there's been some questions about the external nutrient loading as well, the differences between Odell and Crescent. As far from what I've seen from budgeting work, it's really hard to parse out about how much external loading has really increased within Odell relative to Crescent. So I guess I'm punting on that question in terms of like what the exact effect fish might be, or some of the history behind that. But there's a lot of work that's been done on that, and it's something that we want to kind of work towards. I will also say that with ODF&W, there's been some ancillary evidence that harvest of kokanee have decreased pretty markedly in the past several years within Odell, which coincides with the lack of the superficial blooms.
So you're saying that at Crescent there are less of those holiday homes and resorts that exist around Odell?
Well, there are still cabins around Odell. I can't speak to the numbers, but the thing is, they also are present on Crescent. So there are homes, there are resorts. I wouldn't say how different they are from one another, but one question I have is whether there's alternative stable states that have set up between the two lakes, where one is remaining oligotrophic and another has been shifted into a higher productivity type system. I think there's still some ongoing questions about the exact mechanisms behind why this is set up. I'll let Amalia, and I guess we'll go over time. And Sherry, go as well.
Hey, Dan, great to see all of this information coming together. Can you speak to, because yesterday we heard a lot about water control structures on lakes.
Oh,
can you speak to what sort of water control
I
or
should
water
mention
management there is on these two lakes?
Yeah, I should mention also there have been low head dams installed on both Odell and Crescent, more notably on Crescent, where we have about a 40-foot tall control structure that has elevated the lake elevation above natural conditions. That does get drawn down for irrigation purposes. There's also one on Odell. I forget. I need to look up what the height of that is, but it has been modified in the past. So, I guess I'm going to take one more question, and then we'll go on to the next talk. So,
this might be quick. I think you, in answering Theo's question, you said something about ODFW at the beginning. They stock wilderness lakes, and obviously fish have a big impact on water quality. Is there any discussions going on with ODFW? Does anybody consider stocking versus not stocking?
Well, I can't speak to ODF&W policy. We are in communication with them, and we just had a PhD student, Laura Jansen, who's now at the EPA in Corvallis, who had done a work surveying the Cascade Lakes, trying to isolate out fish versus fishless lakes to look at the effects of blooms and on greater plankton dynamics. I would refer to her thesis for some of the results. It was a challenge to find fishless lakes, I should say. Well, I'm sticking around afterwards, so please follow up with questions after we conclude the session. But I think we want to move on now to Matt Titus with ClearWater Analytica. And Matt, you're in the room, so awesome. So cool. Let me get you set up here. So chat up here too. I'll give you a 5-minute warning when we get up to the end. So okay, cool. And then just typical backwards, forwards, and then if you want to go on the slide, just drag it over to the screen. So yep. Or right, I think matter too. So, cool.
All right. All right, thank you. Yeah, Mathew, Titus. Also of the prediction labs, you might know James Watson and I's work there. We started working on predicting algal abundances with the city of Salem back in 2019. And so this has been great. Thank you, Theo. Stuck around last night and I had a drink and I let the mask slip a little bit. I'm actually a math guy. I don't know much about lakes. So this is all really cool for me. I'm hoping that the math here is going to be useful to you. So my company subcontracted with Corello Engineers for a Water Research Foundation grant. They wanted, they had an RFP out for cyanotoxin vulnerabilities, regionally, nationally. And we proposed approaching the problem with explainable AI and attempting to do transfer learning. So I'm just going to be covering that in this talk. So big thank you to everybody that was involved. One of the amazing things about Corello is they got us in touch with over 24 is a lowball number there, over 24 different utilities that agreed to contribute to the project. And so it's their data that everything was built on. City of Salem went above and beyond in that regard. And yeah, to get a special shout out here. But there's the map of participating utilities. So I think everybody here is likely familiar with HABs, but I do have one jump scare slide. We've got plants in the water and they're making poison, and this can be a problem, right? So the drivers are very similar to what drives any plant to grow. And when these blooms become particularly intense, the amount of toxin in the water can kill animals. It can make people sick. So they're quite expensive. I believe the impact on the US economy is somewhere around $5 billion each year. And they're in the news more and more because they're everywhere. They're also expensive to just to watch out for, not to treat alone, but also just being aware of them when they happen is quite costly. And so it'd be nice to know when these things are on their way. It would be nice to be able to predict them incoming, and that's been our goal. So there are a series of steps you can take away from the actual presence of cyanotoxin. We don't deal with predicting cyanotoxin itself. We just want to predict cyanobacteria cell counts or biovolume. That's as close as we can get. We've tried toxin. It's quite a difficult problem. So we stick to cell counts, and you can have algae data that gives you that on the ground, how many cells per liter. But there are also proxies. So the light, the cyanobacteria create pigments, which are visible from often the surface of the water body, sometimes from space. So I think a number of talks have mentioned using the cyan product, the satellite remote sensing product for detection. But kind of the further away you get from it towards general environmental variables, you're looking at proxies of the thing that you're interested in. And but that data is usually what's available. And at that stage, relationships are quite hazy. What effect will increasing phosphorus have? That's not a straightforward one-to-one relationship where I pump in phosphorus and I grow more algae. That typically happens, but things can get complex. And so we turn to modeling because, like I said, I don't know much about lakes. So the project had 3 arms. We wanted to do explainable AI, and the main reason for that is that a lot of artificial intelligence models are quite hard to interpret. So you plug your numbers in, you get a prediction out, and it's really hard to know how much stock to put into that. And so it'd be nice to be able to peek under the hood and know, where is this information coming from? How does it relate to the data? So I'll throw this up. This is the performance summary for the models that we made at a variety of locations. We also wanted to create an interface so that interested utility managers or people in the public could interrogate the data. And I would highlight this as maybe being the most important part of the project, is giving people a way to interface with their data. What's this actually telling me? The model performance is all right. It's informative, but I think that the real thing that I expect to see in the water sector in the near term future is people finding new ways to interrogate their data so that you still have a domain expert at the wheel. So we made this, and we'll get into that. That doesn't look intuitive maybe at first blush, but hopefully by the end of the talk, we'll know how to read that chart. And then we wanted to know if these models could be taken from one place to another. And so we did some transfer learning, and the results there are mixed. I would say the results on every front are mixed. So I view this as like an exciting place to work, basically. We have not planted a flag and said, there, we did it, best model achieved. So first step was gathering data, working with 24 different utilities. We gathered all of their in situ measurements, what they provided, which is tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of data. It's quite expensive to gather. And they provided that to us. We also scraped satellite data, USGS stream gauge data, just public resources. This chart is now slightly outdated, but it's giving an idea of what data categories were present for each of these different utilities. When you parse this out by individual water body, some of these green boxes that indicate a healthy amount of data split up into multiple smaller yellow boxes is how I would visualize that. And what we ended up with was maybe a half dozen areas where we had enough data to train a machine learning model out of the 24 participants. And so this cartoon is a nice thing to keep in mind. Everything that I'm doing here is based on decision trees, and that cartoon decision tree is just a nice thing to keep in mind about how these things are actually operating. You have a bunch of data, and you train, you use it to design the tree. And what you're going to do is bring in yesterday's data and look at it, and you go to the top of the tree and you inquire which of these conditions do I satisfy, and it moves you down one of the two branches of the tree. You do this repeatedly to get to the end of the tree, and there's a prediction associated with the bottom node on each of these trees. And I just want to note quickly, because time is short, using decision trees, there is a time and a place, and I think this is one of them. It's nice to see self-driving cars when they're not running into things. It's nice to see people being able to generate pictures of pandas by typing, make me a picture of a panda into a computer. There's amazing things you can do with neural networks and transformers, but they're not necessary to capture the salient features in a data set when it's relatively small. So the problem is complex, but I believe that decision trees are probably the best tool to approach this particular problem with. And so just to visualize what this looks like. Density 0 would be last month's cyanobacteria count at a location. And density 1 would be the cyanobacteria count 7 days from that. And so I collected this data for Detroit Lake, and you get this nice divide. And what the model is doing is it's taking in variables like that, and it plots the input variable versus the response variable. And it tries to separate them into two groups that have as different behavior as possible. And then you make predictions based on what group you fall into. This step, this creation of a decision, gets repeated and you get that decision tree structure. So I'll just linger here for a moment. Below that top decision on the left, there's the data that where the density zero variable, the last month's cyanobacteria count was below the threshold of 14.8. All of that data goes to that left branch. And then the model decided to look at air temperature and divide it based on what the recent air temperature values were. And so that same subset of data is getting analyzed along a different dimension, the dimension of air temperature. And so you repeat this and you get a tree. We like doing it, so we do it over and over. We make a variety of trees. They take in a random subset of those variables, and you create a lot of predictors. And there's this paper from back in 1990 by Shapira, and it's called the strength of weak learnability. And it essentially proves that if you have models where you have a weak rule of thumb, they're better than a random guess, but you have a lot of them and they're all independent, they're all very different. You can assemble all of those models into something that is a strong learner, aka it can match any given function that you're trying to fit. So we assemble a lot of these into this pinwheel. So I'm going to move the mouse over here. This internal steel blue circle is divided to kind of show where the different models are. And each of them is made up of, in this case, 5 different decision trees. And what you're doing is you're reading from the inside out. And so the root of the tree, the very top node, it corresponds to this sector. And then outside from that sector, it has 2 daughters. And each of those have 2 daughters. And so that's how the tree is embedded in that graph. And so this is just a way to summarize a lot of trees at once. So if I can, and I don't know if I can, I'm going to try to, maybe I'll come back to this. Yeah.
So you might need to go back a slide. You might need to drag your mouse out onto the slide to potentially.
Okay. I think we'll circle back to that if there's time at the end. Okay. Yeah, given time, we'll do a demo, but this is not, unfortunately, a mobile-friendly site. So if you go on your phone now, it won't have the same effect. So first, we'll just run through the case study for Detroit Lake so you can kind of see what the results of the study look like. This is a summary of all the data that we were given. Yeah, another shout out to City of Salem. Out of everybody that we worked with, their data organization was the best. Dozens of utilities around the country, and their system has they've got a database with an API, and you can query it. It's amazing. A lot of other utilities were emailing us PDFs, which is one of the big challenges in this area of science. So a variety of data is available, and then based on different subcategories, we would train models. So if I only allow the model to be trained on the algae data, and I look at the dam, so at the log boom there at Detroit, we have 313 data points. The model that was trained has an R-squared value of 0.589, which you can think of as how, I'll just say a 1 is a perfect score. If you got 1, then you nailed every prediction right on its head. And then as your predictions get further and further from that R-squared score goes down. At 0, you're predicting the average of everything you've ever seen. So it's kind of, if you were totally naive about the problem, that would land you in a R-squared score of 0. So 0.589 is good, predictive. The various top performers, the category that performed best incorporated SOND data and stream gauge data as well. We want to look at how the model would respond to the number of data points it was allowed. And so depending on different data categories, they're associated different colors. Hopefully you can read that. So for example, the algae data category is the dark blue. And you can see that with very limited data, it goes through a spell where it's quite a poor performer. But as more data is allowed, around 150 data points, we get our performance up to basically where it plateaus. So that's a surprisingly small data set to kind of achieve saturation at 150 data points. That kind of gives me hope for other watersheds that don't have a whole lot of data monitoring capabilities or have only recently put them online. So that was interesting. And then we use permutation feature importance to determine which of those variables was informing the model the most. And what this is measuring is if I scramble the input on a given variable. So here, the cyanobacteria counts were the most informative. If I were to scramble the cyanobacteria counts across all of my observations and try and do my prediction, how much does that hurt me? And the answer is quite a lot. If I straighten those out, my R-squared score goes up by over 1.2 on average. So that's how we're measuring the impact of each variable here. Specific conductance was kind of a surprising variable to see on the list. It's the second most informative. And down below, we have the partial dependence plot, which is showing the response. So as specific conductivity or specific conductance increased, the cyanobacteria count the following week also increased. So this is a little bit surprising. We saw the exact opposite behavior at a reservoir up in the Northeast in New York. And then finally, we did some transfer learning. We trained a model at the log boom. We also trained a model based on data at the heater arm and blowout arms of the lake. And if you take the blowout arm, for example, and you take its data and you weight it, so let me point this out here. This is model performance. If I am weighting 100% of my, if I'm giving 100% credence only to the model, the data at blowout, the data from the blowout arm, and I'm trying to make predictions at the log boom, so a different location in that same water body, they have significantly different environments. But if I add in just a little bit, if I weight just maybe 5% of the data towards that we find at the log boom, I suddenly get a very big increase in performance, which suggests that the model might not be able to be uprooted and transplanted wholesale, but with just a little bit of information from a target location where I want to employ that model, I can actually get quite good performance quite rapidly. So that's, I do want to wrap up there. But I'll just note that there are a lot of different things that we can do in terms of further research. There are a lot of things that we could do to make that web tool more approachable for everybody, myself included. And there are a lot of things that utilities can be doing. And I can cycle back to these, ask questions if you like. But a lot of things that all the utilities that we worked with were an amazing help. But there are also a lot of ways that data can be managed better in order to enable studies like this one. So with that, yeah, thanks again to Corolla and WRF, and I'll take questions. You want?
We have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Thanks. So 2 questions. One, do you worry, or do you have to take care of correlations between explanatory variables when you put them in a model?
That's a great question. There are, yeah, part of me would like to do some sort of PCA up front and remove all the collinearity between, yeah, if I've got, there are so many variables that are correlated, but doing that would impair the interpretability. So that is something to keep in mind, though. If you have a lot of variables that all correlate with water temperature, then the model's performance won't suffer, but your ability to interpret it might. The model will lend too much weight to that variable when it's making its decisions.
Okay. And then second question is, when you see that plateauing effect in terms of the performance of the model at 150 data points, is that due to, do you know if it's due to increased resolution of sampling or just more data? Meaning temporal resolution.
So the data set size was artificially limited by taking a random subsample. And so it wasn't a time series that got longer and longer, or was sampled more. It was sampled more
I'm guessing,
finely, but not it.
Do those samples come spaced closer together as you sample more and more, which gives you better predictive power?
I see. Yeah. So it's not a time series based model.
Okay.
And so it's purely
I see what you're saying.
I don't know what just happened. Sorry, I heard it. Yeah, it's not a time series model, and so that's not a factor. It's purely what new information has the model seen that it can use to make a better prediction. Thank you. Yeah, Don.
Just a follow-up or clarification of that last question. Could that actually be an effective sample size effect? So if it is a time series data, if there's correlation in the model, you might have 300 data points, but because they're correlated, your effective sample size might be closer to 150 data points. So could that just be the effect that you're seeing?
Yeah. Yes, maybe that's what the first question was getting at. That is true. That's 100% true. One of the things that I would like to be able to do, and most of our data sets would not allow for this, just given the size. They aren't reaching that plateau, and they aren't reaching the predictive power that I'd want to see in a production model. But the first research avenue here is data set balancing, which would be subsampling that data set for variety. And so if I have 10 of my 100 samples are all coming from 1 week in September, I want to winnow those out because they're going to have an outsized effect on my model's training. Yeah. So that is a consideration for sure. Thank you. If anybody's interested, please get a hold of me after the talk. I'll be around for a little bit, and I'd love to get feedback on whether the web tool is interpretable. This is our goal. So thank you.
Like that. Here. Next up, we have Lindsay Collard from Oregon State University. So here. Oh, and Lindsay has been was a past OLA scholarship recipient. All right, let me get this going here. I think this is pretty straightforward. If you want to use the pointer, you can just drag it onto the slide to the left or the right. And then, yeah, there you go.
Afternoon. If you can hear me, thumbs up. Thank you. So today I'm going over work from my PhD. I graduated over the summer, and this is done under Kim Halsey. She is in the microbiology department here at Oregon State University. I'm going to skim through the introduction of HABs because I trust that all of us have been acquainted with HABs and also the toxins that they produce. But I do want to reiterate that this is not just a problem in Oregon. This is the problems and solutions that revolve around HABs. Sorry. The problems and solutions that revolve around HABs can be applied at both a national and global scale. And also the effects of climate change are anticipated to increase both HAB frequency and intensity in the near future. So refinement and even new solutions to monitoring is going to be of the utmost importance in the near future. So instead, what I'm going to spend a lot of the intro on is going to be an introduction to volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. So whenever you think of VOCs, you think of essentially scents. An example is the smell of the ocean is attributed to DMS. On the slide, I have beta ionone, and that is described as having the scent of violets, which would come off of flowers, but also is important in other things like food science, where it would add depth to, say, like a nice wine. And then in this photo is the Blue Ridge Mountains. So that blue haze and that blue mist that is attributed to that area is actually from light refraction and the isoprene that is produced in massive quantities from the vegetation in the area. And to date, there are no VOC-centered studies that have shown that that there are cells that do not produce VOCs. VOCs are ubiquitous in environments and are produced by both abiotic and biotic factors. So VOCs are essentially these small nonpolar compounds that quickly diffuse in, say, the air or an aqueous environment. And because of these qualities, they also quickly diffuse through cell membranes. That makes them ideal candidates to be signal compounds for those abiotic and biotic processes that are going on in the environment. So this is a slide where it's looking at select VOCs from diatoms or from a diatom and green algae. And the gist of the slide is that different reactions to the environment or different metabolic processes, in this case, an increase in light intensity exposure is going to change the type in some cases, but in this case, the quantity of VOCs that are produced by those cells. And some VOCs are going to be consistent among a lot of your algae within the system. So in this case, it would be, I think it would be the acetone is on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, that's highlighting that there are certain VOCs that are going to be unique to, say, the diatom or the green algae within these systems. And then this slide, so this is labeled as VSCs. Those are just VOCs in this experiment or this paper that contain sulfur compounds. But this is exemplifying that you have VOCs that are produced by these algae blooms, and depending on the magnitude of the bloom and the inputs, that can change both the magnitude and the types of VOCs that are coming off these algae blooms. And that can also have microclimate effects in the immediate area as well. So there's actually not a large amount of work done on volatile organic compounds, and part of that's because of the qualities that make them so nice as a signal compound also makes it hard to study and hard to capture. So with our lab, we used a proton transfer reaction time of flight mass spectrometer, or PTR-TOF-MS. Our MS in particular is named Mr. Bond because he was the 7th one made. And what we have in the figure on the bottom is you have a whole water sample. So you're putting it in completely unprocessed. You can basically scoop it off the lake and throw it into your system. You put it in this dynamic stripping chamber. You take very clean water, you bubble that through, and what that does is it strips the volatile organic compounds out of your water. It pushes it into your PTR-TOF-MS, and there you're going to get a soft ionization process. So you're not going to get fragmentation of these compounds. You're just going to get a protonation event, and you're going to get an entire swath or profile of these volatile organic compounds, and those are going to come out as the mass of your compound plus 1. And this is actually a very quick process, in part because of that, you don't need that pre-processing. So we do a 5-minute bubbling, and then you immediately have your profiles available to you after that bubbling period. And now I'm going to introduce very briefly the system which we had used for our experiment, and that would be Upper Klamath Lake in Southern Oregon. So for our sampling, we did monthly or bi-monthly sampling during the 2018-2019 period, and we collected environmental parameters, toxin, and community composition via 16S RNA sequencing. So to define the environmental parameters that we collected, we grouped these into low cost and high cost. Low cost would be parameters that are ideal for, say, real-time monitoring of the system. So they would be low financial costs. They would be fairly quick to process, say within 1 or 2 days, and they wouldn't require a lot of technician knowledge or experience to process these as well. So for our lab examples would be like chlorophyll, pH, or temperature. And then we also group these high cost ones that you would have available after the fact of the bloom. And those would be like carbon and halide measurements. The toxin itself, we measured it in concentration via ELISA kits. And then of course, we also did a full range of VOCs. And using these volatile organic compounds, we wanted to improve monitoring techniques. So we have our VOCs, and this is going to be broken down into 2 sections. So monitoring of microcystin or the toxin within the system, and then also VOCs and how they are related to the actual like dynamics of the system. So looking at community composition, who's there, who's dominating that bloom. So for our VOCs and microcystin, our goals were to compare the ability of these VOCs to our environmental variables and modeling microcystin concentration and also threshold in the system. So the threshold would be more of like your recreational threshold or drinking water threshold. That'd be a limit that would be crossed that you would need to issue an advisory on. Your goal 2 would be to actually assign punitive identifications for those VOCs. And that would be like, how are these actually interacting in the system and how are these related to microcystin production? And then going back to the species composition, how are VOCs related to community composition? So what is that telling us about who's there and what kind of taxonomic level definition are we going to get from that? And I'm going to skim over this a little bit, but we didn't want, whenever you get these profiles, you're getting hundreds and hundreds of VOCs in these profiles. So to narrow it down, we wanted to put the onus on machine learning to actually obtain our VOCs of interest. We used elastic net regularization, which is a combination of lasso and ridge. And what this does is induce sparsity in the VOCs. So for non-statisticians, you're taking your hundreds of VOCs, you're running it through this, and it's going to whittle down 95% of your VOCs and just leave you with a handful of VOCs of interest that you can use for your modeling. And I wanted to do a quick shout out to Duo Zhang in the corner. I'm actually not a statistician. She's an amazing statistician and guided a lot of this work for us. So what we ended up getting were the linear models, which is basically prediction of that microcystin concentration, and logistical models, which would be the crossing of the thresholds that we were talking about earlier. So whenever you are evaluating the linear models, you're looking at on your axis the mean square predictive error. Just like all error, less is better. So our VOC models are on the edges of that linear model graph. And in the center, you have your low cost and your low cost and high cost models. Our VOC models outperform the low cost model and we're comparable to our low and high cost environmental models, meaning that they are performing just as well, if not better, at predicting microcystin concentration as just using plain environmental variables. The logistical models are a little bit more of interpretation based on the user. So for evaluation for those, we used AIC and AUC. AUC, you can imagine it as a weighing of you're maximizing your true positives, minimizing your false positives, and it's on a scale of 0 to 1. The closer you are to 1, the better your model is performing. Your AIC is going to penalize you based on the number of variables. So you want to try and minimize your AIC while maximizing your AUC on these graphs. Where this kind of comes into play is that how hard is it to collect those variables? So with our VOCs, we're already doing the work for an entire profile. Every one of those VOCs are going to be readily available to you, whereas there might be a different level of involvement, work, effort to acquire each one of those environmental variables. But our VOC models on the edges of that graph have a fairly high AUC and once again, a pretty low AIC. So we say that they are comparable once again to our environmental models. So what else can you do with this? And it's more than just improving monitoring, but also we would like to try and see if these VOCs that we obtained in this can tell us a little bit about the system. So we had 24 total masses that were retained in our range of models. 7 of those were selected in 2 models, and 1 was selected in all 3 models. So some of the VOC IDs that we have as punitive identifications are beta-ionone, sequestered terpenes, and then also some precursors to fatty acid synthesis. And I'm not going to go through this entire graph, but we do have this published in a paper that you can feel free to go and look at. One of the ties in that we had for the fatty acid synthesis and how it relates to microcystin production is that it is similar to microcystin. It is basically reducing reactive oxygen species and their impacts on the cell, including the damage that it may be doing to, say, cell membranes. And if we jump back to our species models, we find that as we work our way down the from the phyla level to the genus level, we have consistent mean squared error values, and we have very good definition and predictive capabilities for, say, cyanobacteria groups all the way through those taxonomic levels. And there's a very big chart on the bottom. Those are the masses that were retained and used within each one of those different organism or phylum, genus, and class levels. And if you zoom into one, you can identify certain masses that pop up multiple times, and also there are correlation values associated with that. Once again, you can use that for future research and say, what is that mass doing? Why is it appearing so often in our model? And what does it have to do with the organisms that are most abundant during that time period? So for conclusions, VRCs were equal to or better than our models based on environmental variables. And we've identified a number of masses for future evaluation of mechanistic interactions with microcystin. And also for the species, we can successfully model community composition at the phylum, class, and genus level. So once again, I've graduated already. I'm on my way out. But my PI, Kim, has continued this work. They do have some preliminary data that I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you about. So they have started to expand this into other Oregon lakes, and this began in May of 2022. So they're working with the Eugene Water and Electric Board and also the city of Salem to not just do microcystin, but also expand to other toxins like cylindrospermopsin and try out this method on multiple other lakes. And her email is at the bottom. She is a lot more bubbly and charismatic than I am, so feel free to talk to her. She will love to talk about her research. And yeah, so thank you to all of our numerous collaborators. I tried to do shout outs for them whenever we came across them during the presentation, and also OLA for in part sponsoring some of the funding for this project. And do you guys have any questions?
Thanks, Lindsay. We have plenty of time for questions.
It's really interesting to think about the VOCs coming off. Do you think the bubbling process is a good simulation for lakes? Because of wind versus stillness? And I'm coming at it from a stream ecology, because we had looked at some evasion from streams of CO2 from streams and found it to really differ in winter and summer. So
I don't think that it's a good simulation for lake effects. That would be much more of like a headspace setup. But what we found was we weren't getting strong enough signals while using headspace setup. So that's why not me, but my predecessor, Cleo Davy Martin, came up with the bubbling and the stripping for the VOCs, just so that we can get a nice profile to work with and a very intense signal. Yeah, like high wind, strong stream run or like a stream running, that would probably be a lot closer to what you would be experiencing with the VOC stripping. Yes.
Is that working? Okay, great talk. I was curious if you explored combining some of the VOC data with environmental variables to combine those into a model, see how they work
Yes.
together.
So we did do that, and the environmental variables were rarely maintained. We actually brought Duo in on that because we expected temperature to be maintained a lot more. Obviously, for volatile organic compounds, temperature is going to make a difference in the releasing of those compounds. But yeah, they were rarely maintained, even with a little bit of code manipulation. So. Okay.
Thanks for this really interesting talk. Can you speak to whether the process that you use to isolate the VOCs, does that contain just information about which VOCs are present, or the magnitude to which they're present, and which of those two, potentially both pieces of information, were incorporated into the models you were using?
So it gives you magnitude, and then the thing with once again, this is a soft ionization process. You are only getting the mass, and then with the error that you have at play, you can assign those punitive identifications, which is why I use the word punitive. The smaller the mass, the more certain you can be with your identifications on that. As you get into larger masses, it would really help to do standards. And I believe that they are doing that on the second round right now. So that would be a good question for Kim, and the postdoc that's working under her on this would be Dr. James Fox too. So thank you guys. Oh, sorry, one more.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm jumping the gun.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm interested, I guess, I have a couple of questions. One's process or cost base. So what is the turnaround time for this analysis and typical cost for that VOC?
So the cost would definitely depend. So the machine itself is pretty expensive, but
if I wanted to send you some samples, how much?
That would be a Kim question.
Okay.
So once again, there's like no pre-processing, so you're not paying for solvents processing or anything like that. You're just throwing it into the instrument and running it. It would be cost of air, which is pretty cheap. And then yeah, the time, like the period, like the time turnaround would be, you could get those profiles in 5 minutes while you're bubbling it, and then you could plug and chug it into an equation and get, results in a day. So.
Fantastic. And did you, when you were looking at the microsystem relationships in the models, were you doing any sort of lag, or was it just same sample, same location?
What do you mean by lag?
Were you looking, as we saw, as like looking a week in the future? Are we seeing microsystems in the future? Are these indicators? Are they just good proxies at a given time?
Yeah, we weren't applying a time series analysis to this. But once again, I think that is something that Kim wants to touch on this. We didn't have the sample definition to do future outlook. So. Okay. We good?
Yep.
Cool.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. All right. We have one more talk to go, and that's going to be by Theo Dreher from Oregon State University.
Do we advance best with these?
I've been using the clicker. Let me get out of this really quickly. Here's up. But what I've been doing also for pointing at the screen is you can just drag the mouse off and we'll go onto the presentation slide over here. So take this, and if you look at the presentation slide over there, you can put it, yeah. So yeah, okay. There you go.
Good, thanks, Dan. In this last talk of our conference, I'd like to go over our genomic analyses of Gloriotrichia, which is a fairly common cyanobacterium that occurs here and elsewhere. And here I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Ryan Muller, who is over here. He's done work with me over the last few years in the multiple genomes that we've described from the Pacific Northwest. Thanks, Ryan. And Ed Davis is a bioinformaticist with the Centre for Quantitative Life Sciences at OSU. So here are some micrographs of Gloeotrichia. It has a very punctate appearance in a lake. These colonies can be quite large. They're sort of like a pinprick, a millimetre or perhaps two across often. And you can actually see that with your naked eye. So with a bit of practice, you can become sort of a semi-expert at identifying Gloeotrichia, as is also the case with Aphanizomenon flossacque, which has a really quite distinctive grass clipping sort of appearance. So at first blush, you can even do a little bit of identification of cyanobacterial blooms in our area just with the naked eye. So what you're seeing here are these concentric filaments. They're tapering filaments. They're narrower at the extremities, and those are vegetative cells, and they're linked to the base core where are present aconites. These are the overwintering spore-like, very resistant cells, and heterocysts, which are nitrogen-fixing cells. So this is a nitrogen-fixing taxon present in the Nostocales. The appearance can vary a little bit in terms of colour. Sometimes those central cells are quite green as they appear here. Oftentimes it's got a brownish sort of appearance, and I believe these are just differences in the state of the bloom and perhaps the age of the colonies, not in, we'll see evidence that genetically this group appears to be pretty consistent across the Pacific Northwest. So here's just another picture. They're really quite beautiful. If they're with fluorescence microscopy, they're really quite gorgeous. So as I said, the Gloeotrichia is pretty common. This is a collation of the counts in the Washington State HABs database, which goes back to, what is it, says 2011. Many observations from many lakes. And this is the occurrence, the number of occurrences for the different taxa indicated when those taxa were dominant. So you can see that Gloeotrichia is not so often dominant, a little bit more so in the western lakes in Washington than in the eastern lakes, but it is a dominant species sometimes. If we looked at the presence, simply presence, of course, it's more prevalent. So it's a pretty common cyanobacterium, not really one of our biggest players though. So in our study, we isolated blooms that were in fact dominant with Gloeotrichia from the three sites indicated. Crane Prairie Reservoir, which is over on the east side, just north of Odell Lake that we heard about earlier. Dexter Reservoir, which is near Springfield and upstream of Springfield and Eugene. And down on the Klamath River in Iron Gate Reservoir, which has got a lifetime of about half a year because it's coming down. And microscopically, these are, as I said, quite indistinguishable. We generated genomes from these, as we have for a number of other cyanobacterial samples, blooms from the Pacific Northwest. And those are the three in that red rectangle. Two of those genomes are entire, complete. Another one is near complete. And these were from, what's it say, 2019 or I can't read the slide up here. 2016, yeah. Okay, so if you create a phylogenomic tree, that is a tree looking at the relationships by aligning the sequences of multiple genes, 32 genes that are present in all of the genomes studied, you can create a tree as shown here. And most of this represents the group, the Nostocales. These are members, this is the group that contains Gloeotrichia that's up there in the two of the three samples are indicated in the dark blue at the top. And the closest relatives within amongst known genomes are things like Tolipothrix and Calothrix, Orlosyra. So a mixture of genera, perhaps not all of those are correctly assigned, but that's a distinct
group, a distinct clade, a distinct branch in this tree from nostoc. There are many, many different types of nostocs, from nodularia. At the bottom, the clade of Raphidiopsis and Cylindrospermopsis, which can be a cylindrospermopsin producer. And that large green clade, which we've also studied a great deal and talked about at previous meetings, that includes Aphanizomenon flossaqua, Dolichospermum, and Anabina. And as we'll see, that's quite a variable group, tremendously important here, with very often present and dominant in blooms, and often is a producer of a number of cyanotoxins. So when we looked at these genomes and interpreted the presence of genes, what we saw was that there were no cyanotoxin genes present in either of these three genomes. That's interesting because there was no, I must say, there were from monitoring over a number of years, there was really no indication that Gloeia trichia was likely to be a toxin producer. That means that when toxins were present, there were no obvious indications that Gloeia trichia was dominant and would be a producer. So it's not really a surprise, but it is interesting from the point of view of a report from the northeast of the US, from a lake in New Hampshire, where microcystin was seen to be associated with Gloeia trichia. I have to go back and look at that paper again. When I did look at it in the past, I thought it was pretty valid. I want to give another look at that because there are a number of ways in which there can be a misinterpretation, just depending on how the experiments are done. But certainly it's possible that in other parts of the world, or other strains, maybe even perhaps here, there could be the presence of cyanotoxin genes. What we did see amongst genes making secondary metabolites is the presence of the gene cluster responsible for making geosmin. And I think people who have been out to lakes and seen Gloeia trichia might have noticed that oftentimes those blooms are associated with a certain odor, a scent, a stinkiness, not that pleasant. And these geosmin genes were present in each of the three genomes. So bottom line is, from these three genomes that were studied from fairly separated by a reasonable amount of distance in Oregon and far northern California, there were no toxin genes, but there was the presence of geosmin. There was also the presence of anacyclamide, which is a peptide that is bioactive. There are a number of these that can be produced by cyanobacteria. Maybe at some time in the future, since they're bioactive, can be pharmaceutically active. They might be of interest in that direction, but they might also at one point be considered a health threat and be analysed in terms of public health alongside with cyanotoxins. But at the current time, that's not the case. So what was interesting is that we saw very little variation in the genomic characteristics of these three Gloeia trichia samples. I said that they contained, all of them all three had no toxin genes and all three had geosmin. And that's just not the observation with Dolichospermum, for instance, at all. They can be either non-toxic. There's a cylindrospermopsin producer in Detroit Reservoir. There's a microcystin producer in Detroit and other places. And in Australia, there's a saxitoxin producing Dolichospermum. So to look at how related these strains are, a common way is to look at the average nucleotide identity across the genomes. So you look at the common genes and just look at how many times there have been nucleotide substitutions. And at the top, you can see for the three Gloeia trichia strains, they are related to the extent of, it's at the high 98s, isn't it? Kind of odd that you can't see, yeah. So they're very closely related. The cutoff for species is 95% ANI. And so in the bottom region, you can see for the Dolichospermums. Now across the top, there's the list of different strains of Dolichospermum and the related AFA, that's Aphanizomenon flossaqua. And the same ones are down the left side. And we're looking at pairwise relationships in by comparing the genome sequence to establish the ANI value pairwise. And so the clusters that you see, that rather large triangle of green, which has ANI values in the range of below 98 into the 80s, that represents one species, one putative potential species, hasn't yet been formalized, of Dolichospermum. So they're relatively closely related, but hardly any of them are as closely related as the three Globiatrichia strains. Two of them are, two pairs of them are, and those are the ones with the orange bars across the top. There was a sample from LBC, from Lake Billy Chinook, and from Odell that essentially were the same strain. And we had two samplings from Upper Klamath Lake, one from Upper Klamath Lake itself and one from the adjacent Agency Lake, where there's mixing. And there was also near identity. But mostly sampling of Dolichospermum across Oregon led to really very distinct genomes. And that's quite a different story that we've seen for Globiatrichia. The same is true if we look at the genes that are present. This is the so-called alignment fraction. If there's a loss of alignment, then that means that a gene is present in one genome, but not in the pair that you're comparing it to. And the alignment fraction for Globiatrichia, you can see, is quite high. And it is also rather high for a number of the Dolichospermums, but for many, that's not the case. So across Dolichospermum there, we have that large orange, purple-coloured species I mentioned. There's also the very closely related yellow-coded Aphanizomenon floss aquae that itself is a pretty tight species. But between those and two other species shown there, they're really fairly distant relationships. A third way to look at to compare the genomes is to look at the synteny, that is the position of each of the genes as you move, say, from right to left, left to right across the genome. And where it's a straight up and down curtain, that means that you have collinearity across the chromosome. Where you have crisscrosses, that means that there has been a recombination and a switch of position from of a set of genes to another place. And you can see in the top row there for the Globiatrichia, there have been rather few translocations. In comparison with Dolichospermum pairs that are at the bottom, where there is much more, there are many more changes at an architectural level, at a rather large level. Number of genes change their position in Dolichospermum. So in those three ways that you can look at genomes, the three Globiatrichia samples that we've studied here from Oregon are very consistent. Here's sort of another way of looking at what we just looked at, where the different gene segments are color-coded, and it's just much more obvious that there's a pretty good collinearity between two of the Globiatrichia genomes at the bottom compared to the two Dolichospermum genomes that are compared at the top. So in our previous studies of the Dolichospermum and Aphanizomenon genomes that we've sequenced here, and comparing those to others that were sequenced in other parts of the world, on the right here, you see a quite extensive tree with a number of branches. And on the far right are the 10 probable species into which this group can be divided, the Dolichospermum, Anabina, Aphanizomenon floss aquae, and Cuspidothrix complex. And within that complex, as I said earlier, and you can see that in some of those boxes, there can be either the presence of no toxin genes, no geosmin genes. There can be the presence of geosmin. There can be the presence of one of 4 different really important cyanotoxins. So this ADA clade, the Dolichospermum Aphanizomenon clade, is genetically very varied. By comparison, that's just not the case for Globiatrichia. So biologically, that's really interesting. don't exactly know what that means, but there are some practical outcomes of this. And here in this conclusion slide, so the first point is these are the first available Globiatrichia genomes that we've got from those 3 sites. They are closely related. I've been saying a lot about that. Belong to a single genus, which is a single species, which is Globiatrichia acuminata. We've talked about the lack of cyanotoxin genes and the geosmin products. And that they're uniform, and the practical outcome really is that it seems reasonable at this point to think that in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest perhaps, Globiatrichia is not going to be toxic. It's not a toxigenic species, and it is, however, it would be reasonable to expect that it's a geosmin producer. So that has practical consequences. I think we have to be careful about extrapolating that to all samples, and it would be really good to have a study statewide of geosmin samples to look at those 2 issues. Are there no toxin genes? Are there geosmin genes? And extend that perhaps to Aphanizomenon floss aquae, because if we go back a few slides here, we see here at the top left, there's another orange bar that I didn't talk about. That represents, as part of that yellow group of Aphanizomenon floss aquae, and you can look at these average nucleotide identity values. They're very high. So the AFA samples across the state, these are from, it includes Dexter. It's not so very geographically varied, but it does seem that AFA in the state is genetically fairly low diversity. The Oregon Health Authority for some time was saying that we're not going to be considering AFA toxigenic. That seemed premature. However, none of these genome sequences that we've identified, the AFA ones, do have cyanotoxin genes. So that's in alignment with their previous stance. They've reversed that for various reasons that I could get into later. But I think it probably is likely that AFA across the state is not toxigenic. But again, I'd like to see a statewide comparison looking at that. And I think both of those sort of studies with Globiatrichia and with AFA would be of real help in protecting public health, because if those are around and we know that they're not a concern, that simplifies consideration. Thanks very much.
Time for questions?
I have a question, Theo. This is Chrissy online.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, we have from, some areas, people moving boats, like they move a lot of benthic macroinvertebrates, for example, and I'm actually surprised at the differences that you're seeing, considering that I always just expect people are moving these things as they move water and fish and bugs. Do you think that even if things aren't toxic now, that there's a chance that someone would bring their boat from somewhere else and introduce the genetics or the lineage that would be toxic?
Yeah, it could be, but we've got a lot of water birds that do a lot of flying between lakes. And I assume they've been doing that, and transferring blooms through across many years. So I think that genetic admixture is probably occurring all the time. Yeah, I mean, I think boats certainly have to be careful moving from one water body to another, but yeah, I think that's happened. Now, it's very interesting that the Dolichospermum group is so varied. I assume we'll have to look into the rate of, see if we can estimate the rate of evolution. I think it's just quite rapid, but it's diversified far more than the Microcystis group, for instance, which genetically is again more closely related, different isolates to each other, and as far as I know, is only a producer of microcystin and not the other toxins.
Neat, thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that thiamoxamonon does not seem to be toxic within Oregon, but from my understanding that there are toxins being produced more in tropical areas or warmer areas. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the potential risks of warming temperatures associated with climate change and the introduction of toxic genes into some of these non-toxigenic species.
Yeah, well, the reason that OHA changed their tune, that is, initially, in my view, said that AFA was not a concern when there really wasn't the data to back that up. Then went back and read a few more reviews that were available earlier as well, which said that some aphanizomenon floss aquae isolates were toxic. The view generally is that the identification of those AFAs was wrong, so that those would be samples that that don't fall within this. Well, I can't say that don't fall within the group that exists here within this taxonomic group. Outside, also in the Nostocales, but in a sister group. So if we go back to this this slide here. That those samples are from outside that green region. And so they were incorrectly named aphanizomenon floss aquae. So, you know, a little bit more work needs to be done to identify that. But there have been real taxonomic problems, which creates this sort of issue. Now, the question of whether there can be changes, for sure, that's going to happen, I think, at some point. Although we've seen that mostly our lakes and reservoirs are pretty consistent producers. So it'd be interesting to see if there are some indications locally of sort of step changes where there's been an introduction of a HAB producer that wasn't there before. But mostly there's a pretty good memory, and it's pretty obvious that's going to be the case because you have a massive production of potentially overwintering filaments, cells, or these aconites. So there's going to be a reliance on the previous seed production. So that's going to tend to propagate forward what was there previously. But I think certainly there's always the possibility that something could be brought in from elsewhere, and we need to be on the lookout for that.